Eric Harris, remember that name? Anybody remember Eric Harris? 1999, Columbine High School. He was on an antidepressant. James Holmes, the theater shooter, was on medications. Devin Patrick Kelly, last year in Texas, that killed 26 people in that Baptist church. He had been in trouble before. He'd been kicked out of the military. At one point they sent him to a psychiatric institution. And I guarantee you he took some medications, because that's all they do in the psychiatric hospitals. They don't do much therapy. They just put people on medications and watch them. And Nicholas Cruz and Steve Stevens and Dylan Roof and Micah Johnson, these are all names of people in the last number of years that have committed acts of mass violence. And they had anger and they had grief, and most of them were on psychiatric medications as well. Let me talk briefly about Nicholas Cruz. Okay, February 14th, you remember the name, Nicholas Cruz. He was 19 years old. He killed 17 students and wounded 15 others. And so a lot of reporters, doing some investigation, trying to understand what's going on here. Why did he do this? And some of the things they learned about Nicholas Cruz that I've learned in looking up articles and so forth are that he was adopted at birth, so he lost his biological parents at birth. And sometimes that can be a big issue for some kids when they find out they're adopted. He was adopted at birth. When he's 5 years old, his adoptive father died from a heart attack right in front of Nicholas. He spent a lot of time with his adoptive father, very close to him. Now, he still had some behavior problems already before his father died, but once his father died, that was traumatic for him as a 5-year-old, and he became much more angry and aggressive, hard for his mother to handle. And his adoptive mother had real difficulty raising him and his brother. He had angry outbursts a lot. He was taken to counselors as a child, about age 5 or 6. He was placed on ADHD medications. So he had a lot of angry outbursts, and he was, of course, because of his behavior and so forth, he was teased by his peers, beat up sometimes, and so his anger grew. When he entered high school, he was forced to take ADHD medications again. He was placed in counseling again. So you see, he's already in the mental health system. He's already getting counseling. He's already getting medications. But things just got worse. At one point, he had a girlfriend in high school, and he was abusive to her. She broke up with him, and he was hurt by that. Even though he's abusive, he's hurt. He lost his girlfriend, and that intensified his anger. He got into a fight she got a new boyfriend. He got into a fight with a boy at school. And the next day, he took a knife to school and was kicked out of the school. So that's what happened with Nicholas Cruz. And he went to an alternative school, but he didn't like it. He wanted to go back to the regular school. And his counselor cleared him as being okay. He's safe because he's taking his medications. And then in November, well, he actually turned 18. He bought himself a gun, an AR-15. And in November, his adoptive mother died last year. And of course, you got another trauma. Okay, he's lost both his biological parents. He's lost both of his adoptive parents. He lost his girlfriend. And when you have anger and grief that go together, see, it gets bad. And he had violent thoughts. And then on February 14th, when he's living with kind of a foster family, some friends, and they allowed him to keep his guns because it was in a locked gun case. And he apparently had gotten a key. He kept a key somehow to himself. He got the gun. February 14th, he stayed home from school. And then he went to school and he killed 17 students and wounded 15 others. When he was apprehended, he told the police that he was hearing demonic voices telling him to kill people. And, the medications oftentimes do that. My daughter has cystic fibrosis. She was in the hospital in Denver last October and November. And at one point, the nurses gave her a pill for some headaches she was having and a pill to help her sleep a little better. They didn't tell her what it was. They don't give much informed consent, really. They're supposed to, but they don't hardly. And she began having hallucinations. And it lasted all night long. She saw demonic images, and she was, in the name of Jesus, shouting out. Everybody in the hospital wing could hear her, commanding them to leave. And my wife was with her and was praying with her all night long. And it continued until the medication wore off. They found out the next morning that one of them was an opiate derivative. The other one was a marijuana derivative. She'd never taken such things in her life. And if a person who's never been through that and came from a healthy family has those kind of images, imagine somebody like Nicholas Cruz, who's unstable, who's angry, and has a lot of pain in his life. Imagine what it does to them, see? And so that's the story about Nicholas Cruz. Now the media and the politicians, of course, they immediately jump into this, and the left-wing folks will say, we just need more gun control. We need to take away the guns. It's the guns are the problem. I like what Dr. Thomas Sowell said. He's a very bright individual, does a lot of editorial writing, and he said this: the key fallacy of so-called gun control laws is that such laws do not in fact control guns. They simply disarm law-abiding citizens while people bent on violence find firearms readily available. Isn't that true? I mean, most of you, I think, will agree with me. There might be some here who say getting rid of the guns is the solution, but I don't believe that. Chicago is theoretically a gun-free city. You know that. Has one of the strictest gun controls in the country, and yet it has the highest murder rate in the United States, surpassing that of Los Angeles and New York combined. Chicago's got a problem. They got lots of guns, and of course they blame it on the guns that are illegal. That nobody's supposed to have them, but all the criminals and the gangs have them. It's just the law-abiding citizens that don't have them, see. Connecticut has one of the highest gun ownership statistics, but it has one of the lowest murder rates in any state in the country. The Crime Prevention Research Center reports that 98% of mass shootings from 1950 to 2016 have occurred in gun-free zones. Isn't that crazy? 98% of the mass shootings have occurred in gun-free zones, like schools, and churches. Some churches are gun-free zones. In some states, they're not. I'll tell you what. Somebody tries to do that in a church in Oklahoma, they're going to be in for a surprise. Because I know a lot of the churches in Oklahoma, and they are ready. There are a lot of people in my church, I don't know how many, if somebody comes in there with a gun, they're going to be really surprised to see how many guns are going to be pointed back at them. And you know what? That's biblical. That's what they did in the days of Nehemiah when they were building the wall. They had a sword in one hand and a shovel in the other hand. And so in the real world that we live in, when there's violence, you have to take measures like that. And I understand that back in the early days of our country, it was expected. Anybody who went to church would take a gun. It was expected. And so now we're kind of getting back to those times where you have to protect yourself. The November 5th, 2017 shooting at Sutherland Springs, Texas by Devin Kelly, he killed 26 people, and guess what? He was stopped by a man with a gun. I went down there and visited that place after that. I waited till things had calmed down a little bit. I went in December to see if I could be of help. And I saw the church. I saw they'd patched up all the bullet holes, but you can see where they covered it up and everything, and very, very sad. But he came on the outside and just started shooting through the walls of the church. Then he came in the back door where the pulpit was, and he started shooting. His intention was to kill everybody in that room. And I met some of the survivors there, and there were three people sitting back in the control room. What do you call it? Sound booth, for a church. And he didn't even know they were there. They just stayed low, and he never saw them. They survived. I met a man there who lost 5 children. No, 3. He lost 3 children, but he lost 5 or 7 family members. He had a large family that was there that morning. One man I met normally carried a weapon with him, but that morning he didn't do it. But it was a neighbor that heard the gunfire that came out with his weapon, and when he came out of the church with his, he shot him. He was wounded pretty bad, and he got in his car and drove off. They had a high-speed chase down the road, and he put a gun to his head and killed himself after calling his father and telling him, bye. So the gun If there had been people in that church that had a gun, see, they probably could have protected themselves. Guns are not the problem. Guns in the hands of the criminals are a problem. The second solution that they come up with, and this is mostly from people on the right wing, conservatives, say, well, we just need more mental health. Let me talk to you about that, the more mental health issue. There's only 3 possibilities for mental health services when you're dealing with violence. Number 1 is anger management. Number 2 is counseling, or what's called cognitive therapy. And number 3, psychiatric medications. So let me briefly address each one of those. I talked a little bit previously, I think 2 days ago, about anger management. And basically, the research says that anger management is not effective. It's just not effective. Dr. Ray DiGiuseppe is one of the top researchers in the field of anger management. And he says anger management classes are a band-aid. They allow people to feel they've done something, but they haven't had any real treatment. They haven't gotten any real help, see, for their underlying anger. And so research has consistently shown that anger management does not reduce the recidivism rates or the repeat rates for offenders, incarcerated offenders. It doesn't decrease it. And so all the research indicates that anger management doesn't work. I've asked many people in jails and prisons if they've been through anger management, and they had, but they said it didn't help them any. So it really is not effective. Anger management doesn't work. One good example of that is Eric Harris. I mentioned him just a little bit ago. Eric Harris, one of the Columbine shooters. A few months before he did the shooting in 1999, he and a friend of his had committed a crime, and they were required to go to some classes, some anger management classes, 5 months before the shooting. He completed anger management before that shooting. And here's what he wrote in an essay as part of that class. This is from Eric Harris. He said, "The anger management class I took was helpful in many ways. I believe the most valuable part of this class was thinking up ideas for ways to control anger and for ways to release stress in a nonviolent manner. Things such as writing, taking a walk, talking, lifting weights, listening to different music, and exercising, all good ways to vent anger." It didn't help him. Anger management did not help Eric Harris. I taught anger management for many years, and I practiced cognitive therapy for many years, and found that it didn't work. It does not work. Now, cognitive therapy is one of the most popular forms of therapy all around the country. It's a very sensible approach. You know, there are a lot of different kinds of therapies. There's hundreds of different kinds of therapies. But one of the most popular, most common ones is cognitive therapy, which teaches that all our negative feelings are caused by irrational or distorted thinking. Now, I do believe some emotions are caused by irrational, distorted thinking, but not all of them, because we talked previously about what I call fact-based emotions, anger and grief and disappointment, or fact-based emotions. They're not based upon a distorted thinking. They're based upon usually events that have happened in our lives. You know, if you lose somebody close to you, that's a death. There's no irrational thinking going on there, except I lost somebody I care for very much. They're not going to be around, okay? And that's a fact. You can't sit down with a person who's grieving and say, you know, they're not dead. I mean, they're dead, and you won't see them again for a long time. If you're a believer and you go to heaven, you know you'll see them someday. But even if you're a believer and you lose a child, you know, it's very painful, and you grieve because you miss them so much. So the problem is cognitive therapy, they try to treat everything as being due to a distorted thinking. If you've been abused as a child, badly abused by parents or step-parents or whatever, it doesn't help to have a therapist sit down with you and listen to you and say, well, you know, you're being a little hard on them. Yeah, they did some bad things, but, you know, at their heart, they're probably good people. They probably did the best they could. And maybe there's some truth to that. But it doesn't take away the anger. If you've been hurt, there's still anger, see? And the only way I know to get rid of the anger is what we talked about before, making a list of why you're angry and give it to God, and He'll take it from you. But it's a fact. You were abused. They were wrong. You have a right to be angry, but you have to choose to give that to God. So cognitive therapy doesn't work to get rid of anger. And it doesn't work to get rid of grief, because neither grief or anger are caused by irrational thinking, but they're caused by difficult events that have happened in your life. So those two types of mental health treatments don't help people. Let's talk a little bit about medications. Medications and violence, are they connected? Dr. Bregan is he's a Harvard-trained psychiatrist. He wrote this book called Medication Madness. If you want to learn about the truth about psychiatric medications, I highly recommend this to you. You can get it on Amazon, or you can buy it through the half-price book club for about $10. It's excellent. And most everything I've learned about psychiatric medications, I learned from Dr. Bregan. He's very competent. He's an expert in the field. And this book, he documents about 50 cases of people that he had investigated, known personally, and was brought into an investigation regarding them, people that were taking psychiatric medications and acted out violently or did bizarre things as a result of the medications. Very, very good. And here's what Dr. Bregan said after the 2015 shooting, the Oregon shooting with the shooter that shot a bunch of people at the college. He said, once again, we have a shooter who has been through the mental health system and has probably been taking psychiatric drugs. Well, later he confirmed that he was taking psychiatric drugs. And he said this, he said, we are once again reminded of one conclusion that comes out of nearly every act of mass violence. Going through the mental health system often makes people feel more humiliated and angry, and commonly leads to psychiatric drugs which do more harm than good, causing or inflaming the aggression. Calls for more investment in the current mental health system are distracting and will likely increase violent deaths. The first time I began to learn about psychiatric medications, I knew nothing about it probably 10 years ago. And there's a lady that I saw who came to me for help with her anxiety. And she had a lot of anxiety about her ex-husband who was harassing her and was harassing her children at school. He was a school teacher, and would see them there and make comments to them about their mother and things like this. And she was very anxious and stressed out. So her doctor, a psychiatrist, gave her a prescription for lorazepam, which is an anti-anxiety medication. And she took it for a week, and then the following week she went back to the doctor, and he increased the dosage, which is a common practice, increase the dosage. The next day, after increasing the dosage, she became very agitated and combative in a gas station, and 4 men had to restrain her in the gas station. She told me this herself. She had never done anything like that, never been like that before, but after being on the medication for a week, actually a week and 1 day, as a result of the medication, suddenly she became violent and agitated. And she went to the mental health system where she'd gotten this was closed, and so she went to another clinic, and the nurse there said to her, you know, that's probably the medication you're on. And so she went to she tried to go back to our clinic where I worked at to see the psychiatrist there, and since we were closed, she just took herself off the medication cold turkey. That's not a good idea to come off cold turkey. It's best to wean yourself off it slowly, because what happened with her, she began having seizures as a result. She'd been on the medication 7 or 8 days and had started having seizures when she went off the medication. But the violence, the agitation stopped. And so she told this to me, and I went and talked with our head nurse, who's a nice Christian lady. And I said, can that happen? Can lorazepam actually do that? And she said, oh no, that woman's just crazy. She just needs to be in a psychiatric hospital. I said, well, would you check on it for me? I mean, I was in her office and looking over her shoulder at her computer, and she looked it up online and looked, and I read it down the screen. Sure enough, it can cause agitation, can cause hallucinations, can cause violence and aggressiveness, okay? And so at that point I realized I wasn't getting the full story, see, from medical people. And so I began studying, I began going online looking for more information about psychiatric medications and violence, and that's where I came across the name of Dr. Bregan. He had just finished this book. That was 2008, and I read this book, and boy, did it open my eyes. Highly recommend it, Medication Madness, and you'll be amazed at what you learn there. The very first chapter of this book, there's a story he tells about a man he calls Harry Henderson. I don't think that's his true name, but Harry Henderson, he describes is a man who was an elder in his church. Hey guys, come on in. He was an elder in his church. He'd never been in trouble with the law before, never been arrested. And he went to his doctor for some medical reason. While he's sitting in the waiting room, there were some flyers and brochures lying around. He picked up one and read it. What it was actually an advertisement for antidepressant medications. He picked it up and began reading some of the symptoms, some sadness and sometimes feeling down. And he thought, well, I'm like that sometimes. He thought, well, maybe I've got a little depression. So he mentioned it to his doctor, and the doctor said, no problem. He wrote him out a prescription for Paxil. And Paxil is an antidepressant medication. By the way, Paxil is one of the most dangerous antidepressants. Causes more violence than most of the other antidepressants. So anyway, he took this Paxil for a while, and he kept taking it for a couple months, and his wife began to notice some changes in his mood. He began acting differently than she'd ever seen him in his life. And he was irritable a lot. They were driving down the highway, and at one point somebody cut him off in traffic, and this man had never done this before, but he began gesturing obscenely at the other driver. His wife was just shocked. He began crying uncontrollably at times. He began buying worthless items at auctions in a manic-like way. And a friend noticed that he became nervous and fidgety and forgetful. And so his dosage, though, was increased by his doctor again. And after about 8 months, he began to feel a growing compulsive desire to just stop this strange pain inside his head. He began thinking about killing himself. There is this painful sensation that people sometimes feel when they're on psychiatric medications. It's called akathisia. And you can look that up and you see that a lot of antidepressants can cause akathisia. And that is so painful that people, when they feel it sometimes, they just want to crawl out of their skin. And so that's what he began to feel, and he began to have suicidal thoughts. I can't stand living like this anymore. He began thinking about killing himself, and then he thought, well, that wouldn't be kind. I mean, leave my wife behind, my kids. So he thought, well, maybe he'll take her with him. He began thinking about killing his wife along with himself. And so in 2002, he began searching for a way to kill himself. He never owned a gun. He didn't know there's such a thing as a safety on a gun. He didn't know how to operate a gun. But he began looking. So the only thing he could figure out was, I've got to find a policeman somewhere that I can wrestle his gun away from him and shoot myself. So what he did, he drove around town looking for a police officer. He found one close to the downtown area where he lived, and the policeman had pulled a motorist over, giving him a ticket. So he parked his car on the other side of the street, waiting for the policeman to get out of his car. And as soon as he opened his door, he sped up and he rammed his car into the police car, knocked the policeman down, got out of his car and jumped on top of the policeman, tried to wrestle his gun away from him. And the policeman thought he was trying to kill him. He's trying to kill himself. That's a little bizarre, isn't it? Somebody walking by helped the policeman subdue this man, Harry Henderson, and locked him up. And somehow Dr. Bragdon was involved in the case, got involved in the case. He looked over his medical history, no criminal history ever before, and he looked up the medication he's on. He knew that Paxil can cause violence like that, okay? And so he's one of the stories he tells in here. Antidepressants, and I'm going to read you what I have on my screen here. According to the FDA, if you look up FDA literature online, you'll find, if you look up what's called the medication guide on antidepressants, these are things that are intended to be discussed by doctors with their patients and families before prescribing them. And here's what it says. They are to warn providers and clients to be on the alert for acting on dangerous impulses, acting aggressive or violent, feeling agitated, restless, angry, or irritable, or other unusual changes in behavior and mood. That's a description that's given in the FDA literature about antidepressants. And yet probably most of you have never heard that. If you've taken an antidepressant, more than likely the doctor's never told you, oh, by the way, you could become aggressive and violent, you could kill somebody, because it happens. And that's what the FDA says about antidepressants. They say something very similar about ADHD medications. Lots of parents innocently put their kids on ADHD medication because their teacher begs them to, because they're hyper in the schools and so forth, or whatever, they're not learning so well. And they just put them on the medication. And yet, if you read the FDA medication guidelines on ADHD medications, report similar problems with them. It can lead to manic behavior, psychotic symptoms, hallucinations, delusional thinking, and adolescents with no prior history of psychotic illness or mania, they can begin to show psychotic behaviors and mania that's caused by these stimulants. They're stimulants. Most parents that put their kids on ADHD medication don't even realize that it's basically meth. It's a form of meth. And who in their right mind would want to put their kids on meth to try to calm them down in school, see? But lots of kids are placed on it. Nicholas Cruz was forced to take ADHD medications as a very small child, and when he was a teenager, he was forced to take it. And some of the symptoms they report as guidelines or warnings for these kind of stimulants are new or worse behavior and thought problems, new or worse bipolar illness, new or worse aggressive behavior and hostility for ADHD medications. And I already mentioned that Eric Harris and his buddy Dylan Klebold killed 13 students and themselves in 1999 at Columbine. Eric Harris was taking the antidepressant Luvox, and so he was on an antidepressant. More than likely, it had a significant role in his violence. You can look at other mass shooters like James Holmes, the movie theater killer, Adam Lanza, the Newtown killer who killed 20 children at Sandy Hook Elementary School, Aaron Lewis, who killed a lot of people in the Navy Yard on September 16, 2013, and Chris Mercer, who killed a lot of college students in Oregon. Every one of them was on psychiatric medications. So Dr. Bregan, his statement he made, I'll read it once again, is we are once again reminded of one conclusion that comes out of nearly every act of mass violence. Going through the mental health system often makes people feel more humiliated and angry, commonly leads to psychiatric drugs which do more harm than good, causing or inflaming the aggression, and calls for more investment in the current mental health system are distracting and will increase the likelihood of more violent deaths. So let me just talk briefly about Stephen Paddock. I don't know what you read about him, what you heard. You know, August the 3rd, they concluded their investigation. They found no motive for his killings, all right? Now, they did find, however, that he was on Valium, but the doctor reassures us that the Valium couldn't have anything to do with this. He contradicts what the FDA says. And so they did find Valium on him, which can cause individuals to become aggressive or angry or violent. There's some other things that they've learned about him as well. He was a compulsive gambler. And if you've ever dealt with compulsive gamblers, you know they have underlying issues and problems. It's like any addiction, and those addictions always have underlying emotional issues of grief and anger and shame that people need help with. He used prostitutes. He was verbally abusive to his girlfriend. And a little bit about his family background. Didn't come from the best family. His father was on the FBI's most wanted list and went to prison when Stephen was 7 years old. And his family was never the same again. His mother had to raise him, Stephen, and his two younger brothers by herself. And the two younger brothers began fighting, and the middle one was beating up the younger one for years. One of them was also recently arrested for having 600 child porn pictures on his computer. This is the kind of family he came from. You get a sense that there's some problems in that family, see? And these are the kind of things that I look for as a mental health person when I talk and I try to understand, well, why did the person do this, see? So these police investigators aren't not trained to look for underlying emotional issues to understand these things. He lost his father at age 7 when he went to prison. He lost 2 marriages, probably had some bitterness about that. And he was on a losing streak. He'd been gambling for many years. He had lost $1.6 million in the last 2 years. He was losing a lot of money. I would say there's some motivation. I mean, there's some underlying emotional motivation for him to be depressed and to be angry. And when he's taking the medication, he's taking Valium, could very easily do what he did and commit mass murder. There's a study that's very helpful. It was a 2010 study, and a couple of researchers decided to look into the FDA database for all reports of violence and homicidal ideation that was reported to the FDA from 2004 to 2009. Because people that take medication, they say, oh, this caused me to do this. I had this real bad experience. I lost my hair, or, this or that happened. They send those reports into the FDA and they just collect those, okay? So they collected they investigated all the reports of homicidal ideation and violence over that 5-year period. They looked at 454 different medications. 2/3 of them had no reports of violence. But there were 31 drugs that reported high rates of violence or homicidal threats. Out of those 31 drugs, 30 of them are psychiatric drugs. One of them is Chantix, a smoking cessation aid. Some of you may have tried Chantix, and maybe you didn't commit any violence, but you might have felt angry. See? You have a testimony? Share it.
I was taking Chantix to stop smoking, and although I was drinking at the time as well, but I became so angry and so agitated at my father. There was issues from my childhood that I got in my car, and I was going to go and confront him. Luckily, I ran out of gas. It was tough, because this was an idiot. And I ran out of gas. I called he was out of town, and one of his friends came and got me. It was just like, it was so bizarre. Total bizarre behavior. I took it for what, a month?
You experienced what
I did.
the impact it had.
As you were talking, I'm like, what about Chantix?
Yep.
I was actually going to look in the book.
Chantix is the number one medication that leads people to commit violence. But there were 11 antidepressant drugs that have been reported to the FDA, 3 drugs for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and 5 sleep aids and tranquilizers. These are all psychiatric medications that people report lead them to violence and homicidal threats. So Dr. Bregan, commenting on that study, he said this study should end the controversy. Psychiatric drugs do cause violence. That doesn't mean every time somebody takes a drug it's going to happen. It happens a certain percentage of the time. But if it's even 0.1%, that means every day in our country there'd be over 300 people that are committing acts of violence because of their medications. And so it's not a small thing if they say, the doctor reassures you, say, well, look, some people do have some problems. If you start having trouble, let us know, we'll take you off it. Well, these people, most of them didn't even know it could happen. They thought they were just going nuts. They didn't know it's a medication causing them to do it. So it's important for us to understand that the first cause, we can't turn to the mental health system to help you because they can't help you with anger and grief. And anger management doesn't work, the counseling doesn't work, and the medication doesn't work. It actually makes it worse. And so we need to look to understand, we need to learn how to help people deal with their grief and their anger. And let me just, let me give you an encouraging example. I say it's encouraging because this is a good example of what has to happen in our country for us to stop the violence. The one I'm going to use, it's another act of violence, and it's a sad story, but you remember the story about Dylan Roof that killed the 9 innocent black people at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. And the next day, they caught him that night. And the next day, he appeared at a hearing, and some of the surviving family members of the shooting appeared and spoke to him. They told him that they forgive him, and they're praying for him to repent and to come to know Jesus. And that was so shocking. I mean, Dylan Roof wanted to start a racial war. But that church was so forgiving and publicly forgiving that nothing happened. There's a reporter in the area by the name of Jonah Goldberg. He said this. He said, not being a Christian, I can only marvel at the dignity and courage of the victim's relatives who forgave the shooter. If I could ever manage such a thing, it would probably take me decades. It took them a little more than a day. Isn't that amazing commentary from an unsaved person? See, Ephesians 4 says, do not let the sun go down your anger. That's exactly what they practiced. These church members and family members were able to forgive this troubled young man because they had the love of God within them. And they were following the clear teaching of the Bible and the example of Jesus. He said, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. Another reporter wrote this. Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina has taken an unspeakable crime and made it the occasion for an astonishing Christian witness. In an unforgettable scene at the bond hearing last week for Dylan Roof, tearful family members of the victims told Roof that they forgive him and that he should repent. They were voices of love responding to hate, of unbelievable mercy and forbearance in the face of cruelty and murderous provocation of an almost miraculous faith. Now, isn't that amazing to hear those kind of words spoken about these Christians who followed the example of Jesus and forgave like he did? You know, one other story I want to share. There's others I could share with you, but some of you may have heard about Ruby Bridges. Anybody heard of Ruby Bridges? All right, Ruby Bridges. 1960, 6-year-old girl was the first black child that was integrated into the New Orleans school system, white schools, in 1960. She was 6 years old, and the courts had ruled that they had to integrate. And so Ruby Bridges appears the first day of school and had at least 4 U.S. Marshals accompanying large men with weapons, and they walked her up the sidewalk to her first day of school. And there were hundreds of white parents standing outside shouting at her and screaming at her and threatening to kill her and telling her to go home and calling her names and so forth. And she just calmly walked with these men into her classroom and spent the day, and then at the end of the day they would escort her out. Well, there was a child psychologist that happened to be across the street watching this scene. He saw her walking up there and thought, wow, I wonder how that little girl's going to be doing later in life. And he wanted to meet her. So he volunteered his service, and he began meeting each day with Ruby Bridges and just checking on her, see how she's doing. And she's very calm and smart and learning quickly and had a good teacher and just did real well. And after meeting with her for several months, he was amazed that Ruby was so calm and composed and dealing with all this hostility. But one day, Ruby's teacher noticed that when she was coming up the sidewalk, that she stopped and her lips were moving. And the teacher thought, well, there must be something going on there. So she shared that with the psychologist Robert Coles, and when Robert Coles met with her, he said, Ruby, your teacher noticed that when you came to school this morning that you stopped and you were talking. Were you talking to the people, to the crowds? And she said, no, I told my teacher I wasn't talking to the crowds. He said, well, who were you talking to, Ruby? She said, I was talking to God. And he said, well, why were you talking to God? She said, I was saying a prayer. He said, well, Ruby, who were you praying for? She said, I was praying for the people. He said, well, Ruby, why were you praying for those people? She said, well, don't you think they need prayer? And he was caught by that, didn't know what to say, but he says, well, Ruby, what were you praying exactly? She said, oh, the same thing I pray every day. When I come, I always say, dear Lord, dear Father, please forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. And she prayed that every morning on the way to school, every morning, every afternoon after school. And Dr. Coles was amazed. He said, this little girl's parents were dirt poor. They didn't even know how to read. They were illiterate. But they had the wisdom to teach her to pray for their enemies. Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. Her pastor had the wisdom to teach her to do that. And if a 6-year-old child can do that, you think the rest of us could learn that too. See? I think it'd be awesome if every one of us taught our kids the same thing and taught them by our example. Whatever it is, no matter what it is or how bad it is, the scriptures tell us, do not let the sun go down your anger. And I even like the words of Dr. Peter Bragan. I love this man because he's so truthful and so honest about medications. And I met him, and he's not a Christian. His wife is a Christian, but he's a Jew. He's kind of moving a little more that direction toward Christianity all the time. But here's what he wrote. He said, as a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, it's apparent to me that the most forgiving people are the happiest and most effective. The least forgiving people are the most miserable and ineffective. A great deal of personal suffering, including what gets called mental illness, is rooted in an angry, unforgiving attitude toward oneself, other people, and the world. And I was in attendance at a meeting with him one time, and somebody asked him, so Dr. Bragan, how do you keep fighting this fight? He's been battling the psychiatric profession for 40 years. And he's been threatened in many ways. And he said, here's what he said. I won't tell you the whole story. He said, I came to a point that I just had to deal with my anger. He said, I had to just give my anger to God. He literally just gave his anger to God. Now, he believes in God, see? And I about stood up and clapped and shouted because I couldn't believe that he said that. But that's what we got to do. The solution to the violence that we have in our country is not mental health And it's not gun control, but it's learning how to forgive and obey the scriptures to forgive every day, forgive everyone from our past. In my book, Stopping America's Violence Epidemic, the last chapter, I end with 7 practical steps for churches. And I'll just share the first 2 of them, are the most important. And here's my dream, my hope, is that churches all over our country will get hold of the book and begin to follow these first 2 steps. Step number 1, church leaders must lead by example and humility by first making a personal pledge to never let the sun go down on their own anger. It has to start with the leaders. I mean, I appreciate everybody that's interested, but you know, if the leaders aren't preaching it in their church and teaching it on a regular basis, you can't just teach it once a year. I mean, it has to be a regular thing, but they got to do it themselves first. And that's the same thing I teach for all of us, that if you want to help other people with issues, you got to do it with yourself first. Start with yourself. And same with pastors and church leaders. Begin by making a personal pledge to never let the sun go down on your anger. Number 2, teach the principle of forgiveness and release of anger through the 2 simple steps of this ministry frequently and at every natural opportunity. So if there's another shooting, it's time to bring it out again and talk again. Say, hey, just a reminder, do not let the sun go down your anger. The church has to set the example. We have to lead the way. We can't help the world do this until we do it ourselves first. And when the church sees it and people begin to understand the church is where you can go to get forgiveness. The church is where you can go to learn how to forgive and get rid of anger, see? It should be. Should be able to walk into any church and hear these words and learn how to do this. The goal of these churches, I think, should be to obtain pledges from at least 80% of everybody in the church body. Now imagine if that happened. 80% of the people in your church made this pledge to never let the sun go down your anger. Do you think that'd make a difference? I'm positive it would. Imagine what would happen if every church in Las Vegas made that a goal. 80% of the church members would live by this pledge to never let the sun go down on anger. I think it would start a revolution and a revival. And so what we can do, each one of us, is to realize that if I bear any anger in my heart, hey, I'm part of the problem. That's what causes anger, what causes violence. People like us that still have anger in our heart. We let go of that, then we quit being part of the problem, and we become part of the solution. You learn it for yourself, you teach it to your family members, your children, your grandkids, and you teach everybody that you can how to let go of their anger. So, I wanted to say that much about the new book, Stopping the Violence Epidemic, and if you're interested, there are copies over here available. Let's take a little stretch here. Let's take a 5-minute break and get something to drink if you need that, and we'll start up again in 5 minutes and talk about overcoming addictions. We'll talk about a very important topic, which is overcoming addictions. And by the way, I've heard a number of people say they'd like to get certified as a set-free prayer minister. Let me just say a few words about that, because I brought some forms that tell you what the basic requirements are. And this is all online too. You can see this online at my website, I believe. But there are 3 basic requirements. Number 1, that you attend the basic, intermediate, and advanced training, which is what you're doing. This is the intermediate and some advanced training too. That's the first requirement. The second one is to receive 10 hours of personal ministry for yourself from somebody that's certified. And so that's why we're here. We're getting started with some people. We're praying with them. And once we go back, Vince and I are going to continue phone counseling with the people that we got started with. And so we want to do what we can to help some people get that requirement made. And the third requirement is 10 hours of observation. You observe somebody doing the ministry. And you can get that by watching somebody that you know in a group setting, or you can watch the videos. I have 9 videos over here, and for the set of them, they're $50. And you can watch those, and that counts. But anyway, there's some forms and things that you can use over there. The only, when you get certified, that doesn't mean you're licensed. It doesn't mean anything except that you met the basic requirements that I think are fundamental, basic. It doesn't mean you're good at it, doesn't mean you're competent. You've done the basics to get started, praying with people. And so that's all it means. And so you also have to sign, I have a list also of some ethical requirements. It's very short, like 13 items. You don't misrepresent yourself. You don't call yourself a counselor. You call yourself a prayer minister. Okay. So anyway, you have to sign that ethics form too. And when you do that, I'll send you a certificate of completion as a set-free prayer minister. Let me tell you about a young man a lady that came to me for counseling. She was a middle-aged lady, and she came for some grief counseling because her only son had died. And she told me the story about him that as a child, he was very insecure. As a teenager, he had a lot of insecurities, and he had some depression. And he began using marijuana as a teenager. Once he graduated from high school, he continued using marijuana, began to escalate or move up to other not medication, but drugs. And at one point, he realized he was addicted. He needed help to get set free. So he entered himself into a substance abuse program. And while he was there, he began attending a local Baptist church, and he got saved. Confessed his sins, asked for God's forgiveness, and asked him to come into his life. And his mother was tickled to death because, that's all she wanted for her son. And he was reading his Bible, and he was praying, he was going to church, and then after he left the program, he continued that for about 5 years. And then he slipped out of it, and he became depressed again. And at some point, he just got so depressed, he was suicidal, and he called up the local police in a small town and told them that he's fixing to shoot himself, and he gave the police his address because he didn't want his mother to come home and find him there. There happened to be a policeman right next door to him, so he rushed over to the house, knocked on the door. The young man came out on the porch and spoke to the policeman for a few minutes, and then put the gun to his head and shot himself. The mother lost her son. And she had prayed for him and was very saddened by this. And so I counseled her, helped her deal with her feelings of grief, feelings of shame, felt like it was her fault somehow, felt like she'd failed as a mother, and she got over that. And so I helped her deal with those feelings. But there's an important lesson to be learned from this, which I believe is this, that just going through a treatment program doesn't usually help people, because this young man never dealt with his underlying emotional issues. He learned about the 12 steps of AA, and he got saved. And I believe in salvation, of course. It's the most important thing in the world. But when people get saved, it doesn't automatically set them free. And many times people have underlying emotional issues from their childhood and from their past that they need to learn how to get victory over. See, and that's what Set Free is all about. We want to help people not only be saved, but get set free. And so mostly what you get out of treatment programs and AA and NA is kind of intellectual help. Just you learn some things that that could be helpful to you, but it doesn't take away the grief and the anger and the shame. And what I have learned is that the primary underlying emotional issues that will lead people to get involved in addictions of any sort are grief and anger and shame. I've met many individuals who had drug problems and heard many times them tell me stories about somebody who was an AA member who'd been there many years and was well liked and had 10 years of sobriety and was a sponsor for many people. And then I've heard about many times these people get so depressed they take their life, they commit suicide. And so there are a lot of good things I can say about AA. I believe in the 12 steps, that they're very biblical steps. They just don't go far enough, because they don't help people get rid or resolve those underlying feelings of grief and anger and shame. And we have to do that. AA teaches that alcoholism is an illness and that you can never really be healed. You live one day at a time. That's not what I see with people who get set free. People that get set free get rid of that underlying grief, anger, and shame. They don't even have urges anymore. They don't have any urges. They don't fight it every day. But people who go through the 12 steps do. You have to work hard, attend a lot of meetings, and you stay sober one day at a time. You've heard that, one day at a time. The basic addiction principle, I like to call it, is this. There's always an underlying emotional reason why people become addicted to alcohol and drugs. Always. I've never found a case where there weren't. Sometimes people will say, well, I just started. I'll ask them, why did you start? Or when did you start? Well, I was 15 years old. Why did you start? Well, everybody's doing it. All my friends are doing it. There wasn't anything else to do in town. And that's not true. I don't care where you live. You can go hunting, go fishing, you can go walking, camping, you can do all kinds of things. But there are always, in communities, there are always some who don't go down that route. But when you feel bad, internally, you feel depressed or angry or sad, very sad, or shameful, you have those kind of feelings inside you, and you're a teenager, and you drink it or you take it in, and you suddenly start feeling better, anything that makes you feel better, you can get addicted to. And that includes food. There are people addicted to food. I'm not looking at anybody. I know people looking back and forth, and you got chips in your hand. I'm just kidding you, but seriously, some people do get addicted to food, and some people get addicted to drugs. Some people get addicted to pornography. Some people get addicted to gambling, and various things that make you feel good momentarily, and then you get addicted to it. And so, in every case, people that have addictions have underlying emotional pain, and when they get rid of that, they feel good and they don't want to use drugs anymore. The urges go away. So the three big emotions are grief, and anger, and shame. Now, we've talked about this before. I think most of you were here that last session, so and I'm not going to go back through all that, but you'll pick up some of it as we go along. I've worked at a substance abuse program for several times actually in my life, and at one place I worked at for a 6-month period, I interviewed everybody when they came into the program. And I asked lots of questions of every one of them to find out what kind of issues they had in their background. Were they ever abused? Were they ever verbally abused or emotionally abused? Were they ever sexually abused? Did they have any traumas and things like that? And what I found, the number one thing that people reported that led them to start using drugs or alcohol was a death or a loss. 68% of them reported some kind of traumatic loss prior to them ever starting to use drugs and alcohol. And that's more than the sexual abuse or the physical abuse or anything else. So let me just briefly tell you what research says about addiction. There's a very fascinating study, an awesome study that you can look up online called the ACE study. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And this was done back in about 2000, around that time period. There was a group of doctors in California that did a study. They were trying to understand why their weight loss program wasn't working. They were trying to help people lose weight, and people would make some progress, and then they would sabotage their own treatment. And they were trying to figure this out. And so they put together a study. And they had a one-page form that they had 8 questions they asked them about childhood experiences, what kind of childhood adversities or problems they'd had. There were 17,000 people in this HMO group in California that participated in this. 17,000 is a pretty huge number for a study. So they got a lot of information. And what they found was the doctor that was leading this study said they found that there was a very strong correlation between the number of childhood traumas that a person went through and all kinds of mental illness and problems, including substance abuse. A strong correlation. And you can see it graphed out. I mean, it's just, if the person had one type of trauma, maybe they had like a 10% chance of becoming an alcoholic. If they had 2 types of traumas, there's like a 16%. 3 traumas, there's like a 22%. See, and just a increased number or risk of becoming alcoholic or an addict, depending upon how much childhood adversity they had been through. The 8 questions on the questionnaire were about physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, if they grew up living with an incarcerated person, witnessing violence in the home, living with an alcoholic or drug abuser, living with a chronically depressed or mentally ill person, and having the absence of one of their biological parents in their life growing up. Those are the 8 questions. They didn't even ask about any grief, which I found to be the most significant one. Those are the questions they asked. And here's the conclusion of Dr. P.H.D, who was the leader of this study. He said, in our detailed study, of over 17,000 middle-class American adults of diverse ethnicity, we found that the compulsive use of nicotine, alcohol, and injected street drugs increases proportionally in a strong, graded dose-response manner that closely parallels the intensity of adverse life experiences during childhood. Basically, what he's saying is there's a very strong correlation between their childhood experience of adversities and whether they're going to abuse drugs or alcohol. He also said this, our findings show that childhood experiences profoundly and causally shape adult life. The major factor underlying addiction is adverse childhood experiences that have not healed with time. And so when you have an adverse childhood experience, what happens? You experience anger, or you experience grief, or you feel feelings of shame. And if that never gets healed, then it results in the person being very prone to have some kind of addiction. He also wrote this. He said, we propose giving up our old explanations of addiction in favor of one that explains it in terms of decisions that people make to seek chemical relief from the ongoing effects of old trauma. He said addiction is not a brain disease, nor is it caused by chemical imbalances or genetics. The basic cause of addiction is underlying emotional pain that people have that leads them to compulsively seek relief of that pain through the addictive activity. It really fits with the scripture. Many of you are probably familiar with Proverbs 31, verse 6 and 7, which says, give strong drink to him who is perishing and wine to him whose life is bitter. Let him drink and forget his poverty and remember his trouble no more. Basically, it's saying the same thing. It's underlying emotional issues that we have that lead us to drink or use drugs. The good news is, as you've been learning, that Jesus can set us free. He can heal us of those emotions better than anything that the world has to offer. He can take away your grief, your anger, your sadness, your shame, and give you peace. And some of you have begun to experience that. I wish we had time for many of you to share that of what you've already begun to experience in your life as you begin to learn how to apply the principles we're teaching. And when you're full of grief, anger, sadness, or shame, you can't have God's peace. And it's very difficult to stay clean and sober when you're full of pain inside, isn't it? I mean, it just makes sense. When you're full of pain, you want to do something to feel better. So we have been teaching how to get free, how to get rid of grief, how to get rid of anger, and how to get rid of shame. And I have these little booklets still over here, if any of you need those to remind you. Any kind of addiction operates on that same principle. Any behavior that makes you feel good temporarily and covers up your emotional pain can become an addiction. Drug and alcohol, pain pills, prescription medications, gambling, pornography, affairs, food, and tobacco. All those are different behaviors that may make you feel a little better for a short while and can become an addiction. So when I meet with somebody who's struggling with an addiction, one of the first questions I like to ask them is this. When did you begin to use drugs regularly, or to get drunk, or to get high? I don't mean that you tried it one time and you quit. I mean if you used it and began to use it on a regular basis. Because when I ask them that, you get all kinds of answers. Many of the men I see will say age 10 or 12 or 14. And sometimes it's higher. One lady that I did a video session with, and it's available here for purchase, she didn't start till she's in her 30s. Didn't abuse drugs or alcohol, but she had all the underlying emotional issues long before that. And she maintained it until she broke her leg, and they put her on pain medication. And then they tried to take her off the pain medication, and she wouldn't let go of it. It felt too good. And the doctor took it away from her, and then she began drinking to get that same feeling. So I like to ask, when did you start doing this? And I like to ask if anything traumatic happened just before they began using. I do this all the time in jails and talk with people and ask when did they start using drugs and drinking. And if they say, well, 15 years old, I'll say, well, what happened around that time period, or how did you feel during that time, or around that time period, just prior to that? And they'll often say, well, my grandpa died, or my parents divorced. Something happened, some kind of loss happened. And that was a trigger. That's when they began to feel bad. They began to look for ways to feel better. Sometimes when, with some individuals, they start abusing drugs or alcohol just based upon one trauma primarily. But most of the time, there are multiple reasons why people feel bad. And so that's more realistic. I may have told you on Friday about this one lady. I think I did tell you this. I'll just briefly tell the story. This lady was referred to me by a friend. She had been drinking for 25 years, and she'd gone to AA and couldn't quit. And so she came to see me, and I asked her when she started drinking. She said, 25 years ago, when my husband left me for another woman. And she was so upset and so grieving and hurt by that she started drinking. And pretty soon she was addicted. And we prayed about her grief, and she got rid of it. And prayed about her anger, she got rid of that. And she just suddenly quit drinking. See? Sometimes that can happen, but most of the time, people have more than one source of anger and grief like that. And so it's helpful to have a way to collect that information to know how to help the person draw up a prayer plan and to get rid of all those underlying issues. So I'm going to move into talking about how to do a prayer plan. Some of you may have this already, but I have some copies up here. Maybe not enough. I think I have about 22 copies. If you already got one, just let them know. But those who don't have one, hold your hand up and get one of these. Now, I don't use this questionnaire usually. I just talk with people and ask them about their background. But I'm going to show you how this little questionnaire will just kind of walk you through it, okay? So if you like it and want to use it, you can use it for yourself and use it with other people, okay? So make a copy of it. And Natalie has an electronic copy of it, so she can make more copies if you need it in the future. All right? As you open that little book, you can follow along with what I'm going to be talking about. So you see, when I sit down with somebody and they're struggling with an addiction, I ask their permission. Do you mind? I'll say something like, "Do you mind if I ask some personal questions so I can understand your background, understand how you got started using?" And people always tell me, "Yeah, they give me permission," but I want to ask permission. I don't want to just butt into their personal life without their permission. Even though they may come to me for counseling, sometimes I just want to get their permission before I start asking all these questions. So this is what I call a social history, and there's several purposes for it. One is so I can understand the origin and the root of their addiction, so how to get started. Another reason is because when I go through this and ask these questions, I'm trying to identify any underlying anger, grief, or shame that they may be struggling with. And this helps. Another reason is to help the individual to understand themselves and to be completely honest. A lot of people I'll ask, "Well, do you have any anger?" "Oh, no, I'm not an angry person. I don't get mad. I'm a very forgiving person." But as I talk with them more, I find out they got lots of anger. There's a lot of denial, a lot of suppression, and lots of Christians do this. And so it helps as you ask these questions to kind of open up things from their past, and you begin to see where the anger comes from, where the grief comes from, and the shame. So it helps them to be completely honest when you do a history like this. And then it helps to create a prayer plan. And on the last page of this, there's a place where you can write a list of all the sources of anger you've had, all the sources of grief, and all the sources of shame. Now, it's a good thing. Vince oftentimes will hand these out to people and have them filled out in advance, and he's right, that it's helpful for people to learn how to do this on their own and to do a lot of praying on their own so they learn how to do it. Because if they come to me and I do it all for them, they leave, and the next time they have trouble, they want to come back and see me. I want them to learn how to pray about their own issues. And so it can be very useful for giving to people, but sometimes it helps when people just aren't very honest, and you can see that. And they may not be deliberately deceptive. They don't see their blind spots. They don't see it. And so when you go through it, you can ask questions and kind of tease things out sometimes. You'll see what I mean here in a minute. So the components of the history are these. Parent influences, sibling influences, school and peer influences, marriages and romantic relationships. Now these are all in there. If you go through there, all these are in there. Symptoms and problems like, have you been arrested? Have you struggled with addictions? Questions about traumas, any physical, verbal, or sexual abuse, and losses. All of those are contained in this little questionnaire. And I just, when I go through it and begin talking to the person, I'm looking for any evidence of a source of anger or grief or shame. So I start with parents, and I like to ask, so who raised you? And when I ask you as a group, who raised you? For some of you, it's very simple. See, for me, it's very simple. My biological parents raised me. Let me just ask this, just for fun. How many of you were raised till age 18 entirely by your biological parents? How many, besides me? All right? That's pretty good. That's about half, maybe a little less than half, okay? But, so it's simple for some people to answer this. Other people, you may ask that question, it may take you 30 minutes to figure out who raised them. I had it happen one time, okay? Well, my first year of my life, my mother and my father were together, but they were never married, okay? And then they split up, and then my mom, my grandmother, we began to live with her. And we were there a couple years, and then my mother found a boyfriend. We moved out, and then we were with him for a year or two. And then so you got not kind of a stepdad, a living boyfriend, see? And you go on, and then I was in foster care, and then I was adopted, and I've had people, it took me 30 minutes to figure out who raised them. So I asked this, and there's a place to fill it out. Who raised you? And then with the parents. So how did your parents get along? That's an important question. A lot of people grow up in Christian homes, and their parents fought all the time. Just because you're in a Christian home doesn't mean there's not a lot of fighting and verbal abuse that goes on, see? So I want to know how the parents got along. Were they have a good relationship? Did they fight a lot? Did they get physical with each other? You know, was there verbal abuse, and how did that make you feel? Because a lot of people with anxiety disorders and fears grew up in a chaotic home. A lot of screaming and shouting and stuff, and they're full of anxiety. So those kind of questions. Was there any violence, any infidelity, any fighting, any separations, any divorces? I also want to know how they got along with their parents. How did you get along with mom? How did you get along with your dad? Well, my dad was a truck driver. He's gone all the time. We got along fine, but we just didn't spend much time together. Got along with mom fine. She was very loving, very good. Sometimes she was moody and depressed, and sometimes she would get carried away and scream at me and whip me and things like that. So those things help you to figure out, maybe he's got anger at dad for being on the road all the time, being gone all the time. Maybe they're angry at mom because she was so moody and screamed so much, see? So I look for those kind of things. Step-parents, how do they treat you? And grandparents, did they help raise you? How did you get along with your grandparents? Sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not so good, see? So those kind of questions I'd like to ask to learn about parental influences. And then I move into sibling influences. How many kids were raised along with you in your family? And who's the oldest, and where do you fit into there, and how did you get along with each one of them? See, if there were 3 other kids, how did you get along with them? And sometimes you find it was good, and sometimes you find it wasn't very good. But you got to listen close and ask to really try to get a feel for what it was like to live in that family. This one man, I asked him how he got along with his brother, and he said, well, we get along great. We're very good friends. And I started to move on, then I thought, well, wait a second, I'm not sure what that means. And I said, did you always get along? Did you ever have trouble getting along with each other? He said, oh yeah, we used to fight all the time. He used to beat me up all the time. And I said, well, how did that stop? He said, one day when he wasn't looking, I hit him on the head with a ball bat and knocked him out. And when he came to consciousness, I was standing over him with a ball bat, and I said, you ever touch me again, I'm going to kill you. He said, we've been best friends since then. So you see, when you ask questions, you find out sometimes a straightforward answer is deceptive. You got to dig a little bit to catch. See, he probably has some anger at his brother, even though they became friends. You know, if you're beat up for 5 years of your life by your big brother, you probably got some anger, right, Vince? Vince can tell you about it. But anyway, so sometimes you got to ask that. And I asked, did you ever bully any of your brothers and sisters, or did they bully you? Did any of that go on? Well, maybe there's a source of anger there. You don't think about it anymore, but you might have planted a seed of anger way back then. And there might still be something there. And sometimes when people start talking about it, they start feeling it. And they say, well, I guess I do have a little anger, see? So that's the purpose of this, to kind of tease all this out and to understand how the person's feeling. Next, I'll look at school and peer influences. I started grade school, then middle school, and high school. And I want to know, well, how was school for you? Did you enjoy school? Did you make good grades? Were you ever held back? Were you in special education classes? Because sometimes people go through that and they feel embarrassed about that, and that affects their feelings. Did you have behavior problems? Did you get in trouble, in other words? Did you get in fights? Were you kicked out of school or whatever, okay? I want to know, because look, if you got a 7-year-old that's getting in fights every day at school, there's something going on at home probably. I mean, he might live in a bad crime area or something, with a lot of gangs, and that might be an exception. But that's important to know too. You know, he might have been scared a lot. Might have been mistreated at school. And I'd like to ask, do you have plenty of friends? were you teased or bullied? So I asked, you make good grades? Did you behave well? Did you have plenty of friends? And I asked that about grade school, and then middle school, and then high school. Because I want to know how they got along. A lot of times people say, oh, I did great in grade school, loved it. Middle school wasn't so good. I started smoking, I started running around, got involved in a gang, and started using drugs and things like that. See, a lot of the stuff happens in middle school. Middle school, by the way, I don't know if you use that term out here. They call it middle school in Oklahoma at 7th and 8th grade. But anyway, so I like to know those things, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I mean, I do this pretty quickly because I try to get it done, in 45 minutes or less. I'm used to a 1-hour session with people, and so I don't want to spend all day there getting their history. And sometimes you get people that want to talk about all this and tell you stories. I can't do that. I mean, if they start telling the story, I say, well, I've only got a limited amount of time. Let me just ask you questions. Just answer, and so I can understand this stuff and gather this stuff quickly. So I want to know those things. And then I ask about marriage relationships and relationship problems. Middle school, did you have any girlfriends? Did you have any boyfriends? Was your heart ever broken? And I'll ask them, okay, yeah, I did have a serious heartbreak. And what was the person's name? Okay, were you angry at them, or were you grieving? I just want to know that because that could be a source of grief. That may be the first loss, and it was very painful. And so I need to know that. And high school, the same thing. If you had any serious relationships, I want to know that because I want to know what happened to that and how that affected you emotionally. Because a lot of people that get depressed, when you trace it back, you find out it starts way back then, see? When they felt rejected, they felt hurt and unloved and no good and all that. And sometimes you got to pray about those issues. I also look for symptoms. I ask about addictions they've had, any arrests, medications they've been on. Have they ever seen a counselor or had a psychiatric drug? Did they get into many fights? Ever arrested? If so, how many times? And I ask them about traumas. Any physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, or any other kind of trauma. And I just want to I don't want the whole story, I just want enough to understand that they've been through some things. And here's the interesting thing. Once you get all this information, it makes sense. When I get done talking to the person, getting their history, and everything sounds great, everything sounds rosy and good, and yet they admit they've got an addiction problem, there's something missing there, see? And there have been a few occasions where I say, well, help me understand this. I mean, there's this one man I saw, and he was in a treatment program. He admitted that he had a serious problem, addiction. And he said he started when he was 13 years old. And I asked him about his family. I had a good family. I mean, his mom and stepdad raised him, and they got along good, and he got along good with them. They loved him. They took care of him. And he had a brother. I asked him about his brother. He said, no, I got along fine with my brother. And I was scratching my head. Well, what happened here? I said, help me understand. At age 13, you started using drugs. You admit that. Help me understand how you were feeling at that time and why you were feeling that way. What would have made you feel that way, that bad? And here's what he said. He said, maybe it was because from age 5 to 12, I was molested almost every night. And I said, well, that would do it. And I said, who did that? I don't know. It was dark. Whether it was a neighbor or a relative, he had a lot of trauma, see? He had a lot of abuse in his home. Now, if I had just taken what he told me about how wonderful his family was, I wouldn't have had a clue. But it did make sense. So then I went back and I said, there's something missing here. Help me understand why you were feeling so bad. And of course that would make sense, right? A lot of trauma, a lot of anger. And so we had a lot of things that he needed to pray about. Now this guy was just fixing to leave the treatment program. He hadn't talked about any of this. How long do you think he maintained his sobriety? He didn't stay clean very long. So when you finish the history, if it doesn't make any sense, there's something missing. Because there's always underlying emotional reasons when people start abusing. Just need to dig a little bit more sometimes. There's a Christian woman that came to me who admitted she's very addicted. I'd never met her before. She called me up and asked if I would counsel her and her husband. She had the addiction problem. And I agreed to do that. And I asked her if she'd be willing to let me videotape it. I didn't know her. She didn't know me. She's from another county, actually from another state. And she said, yeah, sure. So I videotaped it. had 4 sessions. I've got those 4 sessions over here that you can get. I think they're $20 just for those 4. But I did social history on her. You can watch me do the social history. Ask about her family. Ask about her mom and her dad. And she never drank or used drugs until after she became an adult in her 30s. And this is the latest telling you about that. She became addicted to pain pills in her 30s after she broke her leg. The doctors put her on pain medications. And then when the doctors pulled the pain medications away from her, then she felt a compulsion to do something to feel better, and she started drinking. And she was neglecting her kids. And her kids needed to be taken care of, and she wasn't paying attention to them. And the family was afraid that the Department of Human Services was going to come in and take the kids from her. So the kids went to live with a relative for a short while she started treatment. She came with her husband, and I did the social history to understand something about her background. Here's what I found out. I've got it written out here in front of me. Here are the significant things I learned from this social history. When she was 4 years old, her biological father died. That's pretty significant. That starts pretty young. When she's 5 years old, her mother married a violent alcoholic. When she's 8 years old, her half-sister and her paternal grandparents died in a car wreck. When she's 14 years old, she was molested by her stepfather. And when she's 14 years old, she got saved. She went to church. She was one of the youth leaders. And she just suppressed all that. She didn't ever deal with it, just stuffed it. Just suppressed it. She's so busy in the church, which is a good thing. She's involved in the youth group and one of the leaders there. And she said she just got saved and she just forgave them all. And then she just blocked it out. She didn't really forgive so much as she blocked it out. Just suppressed it all. At age 20, she was raped in a date rape. At age 22, her maternal grandmother died that she's very, very close to. When she's 27, her father-in-law died. And to this point, she had never used any drugs or alcohol yet, see. Her maternal grandfather died. Father-in-law died at age 27. She's 34. She and her husband, they had like 3 kids, and they had a business. The business failed. They lost their business. Financially, there was a loss there. That was very hard, very painful. Age 36, she broke her leg. And that's when she started taking pain pills. And it made her feel so good. Not just the physical pain, all that emotional pain that she was carrying. See, do you see how that makes sense? I got all that from her by just doing a social history, okay? That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for anything that would cause emotional pain to help me understand why she got so addicted to that pain medication she couldn't get off it. So we began praying about these things. I made a prayer plan. I had 5 things under grief and loss, 5 sources of anger, and 2 sources of shame. And I began praying for them one at a time. And you can watch the videos and you'll see how she does well after the first session, and she comes back in the second session. She had some problems. She was still so addicted that she was desperate one night, and she drank some hand sanitizer with the alcohol in it. That's how desperate she was. So she still had the addiction, but we kept praying about these things. Her grief and her anger and her shame, we kept praying about all that. And she started praying on her own. She prayed about a lot of this on her own. And when we got done at the 4th session, she had gotten off her psychiatric medications. I told her not to do it quickly. She did it quickly, and she didn't have any problem with it, but she took herself off her psych medicine. She's doing good. She's being a good mom. She's taking care of the house. She's not depressed anymore, and she's doing great. I asked her husband. Now, this is like 2 months later, I didn't see her every week, but I asked her husband how she's doing, and he said, I feel extremely good about how she's doing. It's amazing, he said, it has helped me, because he sat through each one of the sessions and watched. She remained sober 24 months after that, still doing good. I maintain a little contact to see how she's doing, and last I heard, she's doing great. I'm confident that if she started having trouble again, she would call me. But you can look at the videos and see all 4 sessions and see how I prayed about. I made the prayer plan, then I prayed about every one of those emotions. We got rid of them all, got them all cleaned up, and after that, there was no more urges to use drugs or alcohol. She's told me she was closer to her sisters now. She's talking to her mother every day. Her whole family was urging her to be on psychiatric medications because they were on medications. And they kept saying, you got to get medications. You need to go to the doctor and get some medication. She didn't do it. She got off the medication she was on. Her son said to her one time, she was laughing with her son. He said, Mom, that's the first time I've seen you laugh in a long, long time. She said about her marriage, our relationship is 100% better. and she's still doing well. So you might enjoy taking a look at the session to see the details of how that worked out. Now, I've seen this a lot with people that got well and did extremely well. But I understand, I appreciate the fact that there are sometimes complex cases, because most of the people that I see have jobs, they have a reliable source of income, they have driver's licenses and vehicles, and they got some family support. Most people I see have that. When you're dealing with homeless people, you don't have a lot of that, right? It's a tougher group of people. You're dealing with homeless people. If you're dealing with incarcerated people, many of them, they don't have driver's license. They get out, they've lost their license. They've got to be driven everywhere. They can't find a job. If they have a violent crime, a lot of people won't hire them. It's very hard to get a job. So when you're dealing with people like that, it's just more complicated because of all these other factors. And that's why it is helpful sometimes to have Christian groups that have recovery centers where they can go for 6 months and recoup and get their driver's license and be fed and be healthy. Before they hit the streets, that they can build up their health and so forth. But they also need to be set free, because I've seen a lot of people go through recovery programs, Christian or non-Christian, and they don't get rid of the underlying grief, anger, and shame, and they'll slide right back into it real fast once they get out on the streets. And by the way, one of the things I also share with them when I talk to these groups is it's very important to understand, to have a good walk with the Lord, not to be living in sin, because you know what happens, how many of them lose their sobriety. They'd be doing great. They get all kinds of freedom, and they get out and they get hooked up with somebody, start living with somebody outside of marriage. And you know what happens? They lose their spiritual life, they deteriorate, and everything they gain, they lose it. And so that's one of the things I teach them too, is you need to understand, the importance of living a life for God, living for Him, and living free of sexual immorality. So there are complex cases, and even sometimes one of the complicating factors that you'll run into with homeless people or even incarcerated people is they get disability. And if they were to get well and get rid of their depression, they lose their disability. So the government's paying them to stay sick. They're paying them to stay sick. And so you deal with that sometimes. If you get well and you're no longer depressed, or you want to go back to work, see? And you're dealing with these factors, see, when you're dealing with people that have addictions. It's very difficult for addicts to stay clean and sober when they have the strong underlying feelings of grief, anger, and shame. But when they resolve those feelings, it's not hard to stay clean and sober, because the urges go away, and it's no longer a daily battle. And I've seen it many times, that how Jesus sets the captives free. And I just love it when they learn to pray on their own. That's what I want everybody to learn. I want them to learn to pray on their own. I want to help them get started. And then I'll say, okay, we got 5 sources of anger here on your prayer plan. Now, you pray for 2 of those this week on your own. You make a list and you do it yourself. And they come back and say, oh, I did it. And I say, well, how did it work? And they say, well, I don't feel any anger toward them anymore. That's great, okay? I'd love to see that. Because once they get done, they get rid of all this stuff, then I wanted to teach them that now you've got to continue this. You've got to continue doing it. I've had a number of cases where people got completely set free. They did great, but they didn't maintain their walk with the Lord. They didn't keep going to church. They didn't continue praying when they got angry. And pretty soon that anger builds up again, see? It's so foolish that it happens at times. So people have to be taught every day, learn how to talk to God and give Him your emotions. But I love the verse that you all are familiar with, John 8:32, if the Son makes you free, you'll be free indeed. And I've seen that. I believe with all my heart that the Lord can set people free from addiction. And sometimes it happens real fast, but most of the time what I've seen is people, they get saved, or they're already saved, but they're messed up and they need help. They need somebody to pray with them and show them how to pray about these issues. So that's a kind of a brief explanation. Anybody have any questions before we take another little break here? Anybody have any thoughts or questions? Okay, go ahead. I can't put a number on it. Sometimes people will come for 1 or 2 sessions and they don't come back, and I don't count them. They got some help, they got some healing. The ones that come and consistently come back and back and back, I'd say at least a dozen people that have done that consistently. Another thing that happens at events and I run into, we go to a Christian recovery program, and we help and pray with people. And we help a lot of those men. They get a lot of help. But we usually only get to see them twice. So some of them, it helps immensely, and we preach to them, we teach them, you've got to continue this. See? So we don't get any follow-up with them. It's really hard to tell. But I've seen quite a few people that would come back consistently. See, where I worked at before, they didn't have to pay anything. I worked for the Choctaw Nation. Anybody that was a registered Choctaw could come there for free of charge. And so they would come, and they'd come, and they'd come. Okay, and that's where I saw a lot of people get set free. I saw a lady that had been through a treatment program already. She'd been there, I think it was a 6-month program she went through. And she said, everybody I went through the program with, every one of them has relapsed except me. And she said, I'm that close to relapsing. And she had some issues. I made a prayer plan up. I prayed with her about all that stuff. She got completely set free, and she's still doing good, doing great. See, so when you have the opportunity to complete it, see that's the key. So just 1 or 2 treatment sessions usually isn't going to do it. I've also had a few cases of people that did very, very well, and then they let resentments build up, and after a while they'll lose it because they don't continue on. See, it's still a miracle. It's a miracle. I see people get rid of anger miraculously and grief, and I know it works. Any other questions? Let's take a 5-minute break, stretch, and then we're going to talk about depression. Okay, we're going to talk in this next session about overcoming depression, and it's an important topic because there are a lot of people that experience depression at times, and I'm going to share with you the bad news and the good news. Many of you are familiar with Robin Williams, and you know that he died in 2014, hung himself. He was a comedian and actor, and I never was a great fan of him, but I enjoyed him, and it was sad when he died. Most people know that he abused drugs back and alcohol in the 70s and the 80s, and then he was sober for 20 years. And in 2006, he relapsed, and he went into a program, and then in 2014, he relapsed again. He was depressed, and he went into a well-known, famous treatment program called the Hazelden Treatment Program up in Minnesota on July the 1st, 2014. And he was given a cocktail of medications for his depression, and his family reported that he was sleeping 20 hours a day. And when he was awake, the 4 hours a day, he kept his blinds pulled so it was darkened inside. So he wasn't doing real well after being put on all these medications. And of course, he had the best treatment that money can buy. He had plenty of money to get treatment. And one writer described him this way. He said, he made all of us laugh, but nobody's laughing anymore after what happened. And so depression is a very important topic to talk about, and how to overcome depression. I had the first time after I learned this ministry, learned how to pray with people about grief and anger and shame, I had a pastor come to me out in Tennessee who was very depressed. Actually, I received a phone call from an insurance company, and they were referring this man to me. He was in a psychiatric hospital, and he was fixing to be released. And they had tried to medicate him. The medications weren't working. And so they gave him electroconvulsive shock treatments. And you may have thought that was something from the past, but it's not. It's coming back. And it's gaining in popularity. It's happening more and more. It's pretty crude, really. You just kind of hook somebody up to a machine like that and shock them and think that somehow that's going to fix some kind of cells or something in your brain. It's kind of like if your computer's messing up, stick it in a 220 outlet and just give it a little zap and see if maybe it'll work right. And it's not very good to do that with human brains. But anyway, this man he'd been through ECT, and they said he'd probably be a little confused, and he was. But they told me he was coming, and so he came, and I found out his story. What he told me was this: that he was a bivocational pastor. He worked a full-time job to support himself, and he worked part-time as a pastor in Tennessee. And one morning he went to church, gave his message. His wife didn't feel good, stayed home. And when he came back home, he found his wife had committed suicide while he was at church. And he got real depressed. He felt like, I was a failure. I wasn't a good father. I should have known this. I'm a good husband. I should have known there's something wrong. I overlooked it. He didn't even know she was depressed. But in addition to that, 5 years before that, he had a son who had committed suicide. So this is the second suicide in his family. You can understand with circumstances like that why a person might be a little down or depressed. And so he was depressed, and the doctor put him on one medication, then another one. Nothing was working. Because antidepressants are very ineffective, and we'll look at that in a little bit. And so they committed him to the hospital, and he got all these shock treatments, and there was some brain damage, and he recovered some of his memory, but not all. So I began to see him and to talk with him about these losses, the suicide of his wife and the suicide of his son. We prayed about each one of them, and usually when there's a suicide, there's several different feelings that people have. A lot of times there's anger. They're angry because why would they do this to me, see? Secondly, there's loss. You miss them. You just miss them. Sometimes there's sadness. Just sad. This person's too young to die. So there's sadness there. And sometimes there's shame. It's my fault. I should have known better. If I was a good husband or a good parent, this would not have happened, see? And so I helped him pray about each one of those issues and got rid of that. First about his wife and then about his son. And we prayed about some other things that were going on. And after several months, he was doing pretty good, feeling good, and he told me he was doing good. And so he asked his doctor to take him off his medications, and he did good. Here's a man that was deeply depressed, and the world's solutions weren't working. The pills weren't working, and the ECT wasn't working. But I was able to pray with him and see him get set free. That was the first time after I learned this ministry, the first time I'd seen somebody who was depressed and helped them overcome that. And so the more I see that, of course, the more clear it was to me that this is not a brain disorder. This is a guy that has dealt with some traumas, and he needs somebody to help him get rid of those feelings. Talk about them and learn how to get rid of them. While I was working for the Choctaw Nation, one time the department I worked for, they brought in a gentleman to do a presentation. He was flown in from New York to Oklahoma, and he had been a policeman for 17 years in, I think it was Syracuse, New York. And he became very, very depressed. And he threatened to kill himself and locked himself in his room, and his commanding officer had to come and order him to open the door and come with him to the hospital to get him out of there. But they committed him to a hospital, and they medicated him, and they after about 3 or 4 days, they were going to release him. And while the nurse was wheeling him out in the wheelchair like they always do from hospitals, he began talking with her, and he told her what his plans were when he got home, how he was going to kill himself. So she turned the wheelchair around and took him back in and committed him a second time. He was committed like 6 different times there in a row. They kept medicating, and then they started using electroconvulsive shock with him. Had 12 shock treatments. And then he was on a lot of medications. Now this man's telling the story himself. This is personal testimony. And I appreciate that kind of honesty, that kind of a candidness to talk about your struggles. And after he got out of the hospital, he resigned the police force. He became a trainer to train them how to deal with people with mental illness. And he also, interestingly, became a pastor of a Lutheran church. And he continued that for some time. He said then in 2008 he was hospitalized again. He had a relapse. He was depressed again, having more suicidal thoughts. And so he had some more shock treatments and increased his medications. And here's how he concluded his talk with us. He said, I take 6 medications every day, and I have suicidal thoughts every day, and I have to take them the rest of my life because I have a brain disorder. And that's his conclusion. Everybody in the room thought it was great, but I didn't. I felt depressed about it because it made me feel hopeless. If I had to live like that, I'd feel very hopeless, see? And that's what depression is. I mean, it's a strong sense of hopelessness. Nothing will ever improve. Nothing will ever change. And so, I think it's very sad and unfortunate that in our society in this day and age, we hear a lot of that. That same message is given to people that you're going to have to be on these medications the rest of your life. That depresses them. And this is the best it can get. And so he believed that he had a brain disorder. Many of you are familiar with Pastor Rick Warren. I think very highly of Rick Warren, the books he's written, Purpose-Driven Life and Purpose-Driven Church and so forth. And, you know, he's one of the individuals that started up the Celebrate Recovery program. I think a lot of good has been done there. Many of you also know that in 2013 that his 27-year-old son committed suicide. And that's a very sad thing. Anybody to have to go through. And he left the pulpit at his church for 4 months as he and his family and his wife collected themselves. And when he came back, I was listening on television when he came back and he spoke to his church. And here's what he said. He said, I was in shock for at least a month after this happened. He said, I had prayed for my son for 27 years for his healing. It was my number one prayer. He said he had the best counselors and doctors available to him. And it has given him a strong desire to minister to people struggling with mental illness. Here's what he said. He said, if you struggle with a broken brain, you should be no more ashamed than someone with a broken arm. He told the people, he said, it's not a sin to take meds. It's not a sin to get help. You don't need to be ashamed. Now, I agree. There's nothing to be ashamed of. But I don't agree that you have a broken brain when you have depression. And I can say to you confidently that there is not any research evidence that there's a broken brain, even though we've been fed that belief for many years that you have a chemical imbalance or a broken brain. And that's been largely used by the pharmaceutical companies as a means of marketing their medications. They're making billions and billions of dollars off of that. But it is a belief that we have, and that's what I want to address, this hopelessness. I believe the church has bought into this same concept. They've heard it so much. They haven't heard anything else. And they bought into the concept of mental illness, that our emotional struggles are just due to a brain disorder or a chemical imbalance. And when pastors say things like this, what they're saying is this is just as good as it gets. Just take your medications and be happy. I believe this is blatantly unbiblical. I believe it leads to strong feelings of hopelessness. And when churches give this kind of message, they fail to offer hope to the world. That's not a hopeful message. But here's what the scriptures say. In Romans 15:13 says, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that you will abound in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. We have a message of hope. It is not a hopeless message. And the message of medications and psychiatric medication and so forth is a very hopeless world that people live in. 1 Timothy 4:10 says, we have fixed our hope on the living God. Ephesians 2:12, Paul says that you were separated from Christ, but having no hope and without God in the world. In this world without Christ, there is no hope. But when we have Christ in life, there is hope. Even when it comes to depression. Yeah, I know there are a lot of Christians and very well-known Christians and missionaries in the past too that have struggled with depression. But there is hope for people with depression. A lot of scriptures talk about the peace that we can have, and when you're full of depression, you don't have peace. It's the opposite of peace. Jesus said, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives do I give unto you. Let not your heart be troubled or agitated, or let it be fearful. So peace is something God wants us to have, and hope is something that we can have as well. One of my favorite pastors I heard speak over Easter, I think a year and a half ago. And man, I love his preaching. I love to listen to him. And on Easter, he was preaching about grief. He said that your grief will never go away. You just have to live with it by God's strength. Tough it out day by day. But I can personally testify, I've seen a whole lot of people get rid of grief. And I know that God can take away grief. Any grief you have, I guarantee you that if you follow these 2 steps that we've talked about, you can get rid of your grief. I don't care how painful it is. And I've seen people with all kinds of terrible grief that they've gone through. They've gotten rid of it quickly. 2 simple steps for those of you that may not have been here on Friday when we talked about it. 2 simple steps for getting rid of grief. Number 1, be honest with God by making a list of everything you miss about that person. And then, number 2, say a prayer and tell God what you miss about him. Ask him to take it from you. And when you do that, the grief goes away. Now, if that grief is not 100% gone, it usually means you just missed something. You just make a second list to do it again, and it goes away. And I have not seen this fail yet. People can get rid of grief, okay? So I don't believe what this pastor said, that you have to live with it the rest of your life. I know it's traumatic. Sometimes things are very, very traumatic. But we have an awesome God, a powerful God, who can take it and care it for you. He wants to take it from you. Grief is normal, but he does not want us to be stuck in grief, because when you get stuck in grief, it turns into depression. Another pastor I know, I appreciate his candidness, but he said he used to be an alcoholic, and he said he still feels like drinking sometimes. He says, every Sunday night I feel like drinking. And, you know, I appreciate his honesty, but I'd rather see people get rid of their addiction and not have those urges, you know, to do that. And that can happen. These kind of statements make Christians feel hopeless, make them believe that they can never expect to be free from these struggles. It is true that we will never be free of sin in this life, but it is not true that you can never be free of grief or depression. You can be free of that. You know, this is really what got me into the mental health field in the first place, when I saw all these things in my church, my home church, and I saw good Christian people that loved God and knew the Word of God, and yet they didn't have any answers for how to deal with emotions that people are going through. And I saw that, also all the struggles that people were having in my church, and it drove me to want to go into psychology and counseling to learn how to help people. And then after 25 years of trying to do it the world's way, I realized that wasn't working. It didn't work. They didn't know how to help people with grief. They don't know how to help people with anger. And so I am very excited that I've found something that works. And it's prayer, and it's God. And it's not just generic prayer, but learning how to pray about your grief. And the anger, the same thing. Make a list of reasons for your anger toward one person, all your resentments. And then number 2, you tell God, I'm tired of carrying this, please take it. And he takes it from you. And it's awesome to watch that happen with people. I had a man who came to me. He had lost his job, and he was very, very depressed. And, actually, this guy, he heard me. His doctor went to a seminar that I did, and he referred this man to me. And this man had been depressed for a long time. The doctor had him on medications. And he'd been taking medication since 19 years earlier, when his wife had left him for another woman. And he didn't want to be divorced. He wanted to be with that woman the rest of his life. And that's when he said his vows, he meant them. But he got depressed, and so he went on medications. And then 4 years before I saw him, and I may have shared this with you already. It sounds familiar, like I may have told you this. But 4 years before I saw him, his second wife died. And the same month his wife died, his mother and father died the same month. And then 3 months before I saw him, he lost his job that he'd held for 27 years. So he's depressed. And he'd been on antidepressants for 19 years, and they weren't helping him. But I began to pray with him about his loss of his second wife, his loss of his mother, his loss of his father, his loss of his first wife, his loss of his job. And as we prayed about all those things, the depression just completely went away. He told his doctor he's doing good and asked him to take him off his medication, and he took him off it, weaned him off it. And by the way, sometimes you just have to, when you feel good, you got to tell your doctor. You can't let them just tell you that. You know, you need to be on this the rest of your life, because you're feeling good and you've gotten healing. Then you just have to tell the doctor sometimes to do it, because they won't do it otherwise. This man was set free from his depression through prayer. So I'm sure you've heard the theory, the belief that depression is caused by chemical imbalances, and that's what the pharmaceutical company has been teaching us for 20 years or more. And yet it's not true. There's a study that I really admire very much. It's called the Virginia Twin Study, and these researchers are trying to understand out of the mental health problems that people experience, which of them are caused by life experiences and which of them are caused by genetic disorders and biological issues. What they found in this study was that 87% of all the people they interviewed that had depression, that there was a cause. 87% of them had some kind of loss. They lost a job, they lost a loved one, they lost their health, lost their relationship. See, 87%, according to this research, of people that are depressed is due to some kind of loss. Well, if you're a secular counselor and you don't know how to help people with grief, that doesn't help you because you don't know how to help them with grief either. See, and that's what I went through all these years trying to help people. I didn't know how to help anybody with grief or anger, but that's good, helpful research. And so what they found is only 12.6% of all depressive episodes were not apparently caused by some kind of loss. What I've come to believe is a lot of that is caused by sexual abuse. I've seen a lot of people that were sexually abused, and they experienced depression too from the day that they were sexually abused. And I believe that accounts for a lot of it. So man's solution is finding peace by pills. There was a $20 million study done, paid for by the U.S. government, and they were trying to get an idea of how many people in our country deal with mental illness. And they came to the conclusion that 48% of all Americans will experience some kind of mental illness in their lifetime. That's a pretty high figure. That's half of our country is going to have some kind of mental illness. And the director of this program, his name is Thomas Insel, Dr. Insel. He was disappointed to learn from this study that about a third of the people that were depressed were relying exclusively on non-professional sources and spiritual advisors for their help. And here's what he said. He said, you wouldn't rely on your priest for treatment if you had breast cancer. Why would you go to your priest for a major depressive disorder? These are real medical and brain disorders, and they need to be treated that way. So that's where we get this idea, see, that a lot of the doctors will tell us that. But I'd like to get a second opinion. And that's why I recommend Dr. Peter Breggin. And I think I showed you this book a little bit ago, Medication Madness. It's an awesome book. It's very readable. And he explains to you the impact of medications and how they affect you. He's an expert. And he's so good that he has actually won court cases against pharmaceutical companies. And anytime there's a court case, a legal suit brought against pharmaceutical companies because of drugs, if Dr. Breggin is on a list of witnesses, they just settle out of court. They don't even bother with it. They just settle out of court. Give them $20 million and you don't ever raise the subject again and nobody hears about it. They just buy them off, see? But he's got all the facts. And so they're making a lot of money and they don't want people to know. Dr. Breggin is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist. He's been in private practice in New York since 1968. He's been an expert witness many times, and he's been called the conscience of psychiatry for his efforts to expose the harmful side effects and abuses of psychiatric medications, electroshock, lobotomies, and drugging of children. He's written dozens of scientific articles and more than 20 books, including this book, Medication Madness. So I encourage you, if you're interested in the subject, get a copy of his book. And he says that many psychiatric medications cause brain injury, depression, suicidality, hallucinations, delusions, panic attacks, and severe mania. He recommends that doctors never use them. He says the only time he uses them is when somebody's trying to get off medications. He'll prescribe medications for them and gradually wean them off the medications. He'll use them that time. Sometimes people have been on the medication for so long that it's a lengthy process to slowly taper them off the medication. And they'll get to a certain point and they can't go any further for a while. You've got to hold it there. And so it really takes an expert. And he's written a book also on how to get off of psychiatric medications. Let me ask you a question. I've talked to several groups here, and I'm not sure if I told you about the lady that came to me with the anxiety disorder. I think I told you that just a little bit ago, didn't I? The lady that was taking lorazepam. Didn't I talk about that? Somebody nod if that sounds familiar. Did I talk about lorazepam a little bit ago? Okay, all right. And anyway, that's where I first got into this. And this lady, she's so anxious, and doctor put her on lorazepam, and she became delusional and aggressive. And when she took herself off the medication, she began having seizures. And so it's very, very important to do it slowly. I've seen people get off it quickly, and they did fine, but it's risky. Here's what Dr. Peter Breggin says about the chemical imbalance theory. He says, there is no chemical imbalance. That is a fable that was invented by the pharmaceutical industry to sell medications. The only chemical imbalance that occurs is when people take psychiatric medications, and that alters their brain. There you have a chemical imbalance. And by the way, this is well documented in the psychiatric mental health literature that there's a diagnosis called a drug-induced disorder, drug-induced or medication-induced disorder. Some medication you take can make you psychotic and hallucinate, and that properly should be diagnosed as a medication-induced disorder. It's caused by the medication. But they don't usually recognize that. Usually the doctor, you go into an emergency room, they say, oh, he's psychotic. We'll put him on an antipsychotic medication, see? And they don't realize that the symptoms they're having are being caused by their medications. I told you about the Harry Henderson, and the man that went to the doctor, read about depression, and his doctor put him on Paxil, and then he assaulted a police officer, right? I told you about that. I'm repeating myself too many times on my notes. I jumped ahead a little bit, so I was sure I told you about that. I saw a woman who came to me for depression, and she was referred to me by a friend, and she lost her mother a year earlier, and she's still very depressed, and she was crying every day, and she was afraid she's going to lose her job, and she's going to lose her husband, he's going to get tired of her crying all the time, and so we talked about her mother, and she spent most of the hour talking about her mother, and I made a list of all the things that she missed about her mother, and I shared with her how she could get rid of that grief by making that list up and praying and giving it to God. So she's wanted to do that, and I prayed and led her in the prayer, and after she said the prayer, her grief was suddenly gone. She'd been on antidepressants for a year. And when she came back 2 weeks later, I asked her how she's doing. She said, good. I don't feel depressed anymore. I don't feel any grief anymore. When I asked her, well, what do you attribute that to? She said, well, my doctor put me on new medication recently, and I think it finally kicked in. I saw her change instantly in a 1 hour session, and she got rid of the grief. It had nothing to do with medication. She'd been on medication for an entire year, and it hadn't helped her. But people are so indoctrinated into that they will say that. I had a lady come to me. She's an elderly lady, and she told me that 3 days before I saw her, she said that her cousin had died. And she said she wasn't really close to her, but it was sad. She felt sad for her. She was a nice lady, and she played the piano and sang beautifully, and so she felt kind of sad about it. And when the next day she saw her doctor, and her doctor said, "Oh, you're depressed," and she prescribed her a medication. I mean, you can't even diagnose a person a day later after a death that the person's depressed. But the doctor prescribed an antidepressant for her. And so she told me this, and I said, well, would you like to get rid of that sadness you feel? And she said, yeah. She said, actually, I don't feel too bad. She said, I prayed with my church, and and I feel a lot better. But I said, if you could get rid of that sadness you feel, would you like to do that? And she said, yeah. So we made a list of the things she missed about her cousin. And we prayed and gave it to God, and it was suddenly gone. Thank you. So she smiled and she said, well, I'm just going to throw those pills away. But it amazes me how many stories I hear from people that go to the doctor, and the very first thing they say, here, take a pill. This pill will fix you. And they don't tell you, they don't give you any informed consent or tell you how dangerous they can be. There are a lot of things that you say about antidepressants. And let me just say a few things, make a few notes. And you learn all this and a lot more from Medication Madness. But number one, antidepressants are very ineffective. They don't work well. Now, some people will take them and say it helped them. And it can help maybe up to about 8 to 10 weeks. They get a little bit of effect. Some people do. Not everybody. Not even most people. But some people will say it helps them. But after 8 to 10 weeks, the research shows that it doesn't have any effect. It's no more effective than a placebo, a sugar pill. You think you're taking something that's helping you, and you feel better because you think you're taking something. And that's how effective antidepressants are. They were very hard to sell. In 1988, this is a true story, and I was just sharing this with one of the gentlemen here, that in 1988 is when Paxil was the first SSRI medication that was introduced into this country. The Germans had already rejected it. They tried to sell it in Germany, and they rejected it. They flat out said it's no good. That medication is good for nothing, because the studies had shown that number one, it wasn't effective. Number two, it had all kinds of adverse side effects. So they brought it to this country, and they put a huge marketing effort behind it, got a bunch of psychiatrists, well-known psychiatrists, to say how wonderful it was. And over a 4-year period of time, they sold so much Paxil that it was the first billion-dollar medication in 1 year. That's the marketing that they put into Paxil to sell it. And ever since then, there's been new medications, new forms of SSRIs and so forth. So they're not effective, number one. Number two, they have all kinds of dangerous side effects. And this is not coming from me. I refer you to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. In their own literature, it warns of the dangerous side effects, which can include aggression and violence and suicidality. And I've known many people who actually went through that, became suicidal as a result of being placed on medications. I counseled a family of a young lady. She's 14 years old, and she was a little depressed, and so her doctor put her on Zoloft, and she became very suicidal. She was seeing a counselor, and her counselor told her, said, you need to talk to your doctor. You need to go back to your doctor quick and get that medication changed, because she could see how it was connected. And she had just compulsive thoughts about suicide. Well, before she could get back to the doctor, she got into a little argument with her family about something. She ran out in the woods. They lived out in the country. She ran out in the woods. And her mom and dad went looking for her. Mom went one direction, dad went the other direction looking for her. And they found her hanging from a tree, 14-year-old girl. And I counseled that family and helped them to overcome their grief and feelings of shame and so forth. And I know it doesn't happen with everybody that takes antidepressants, but the FDA confirms that they're dangerous. They have dangerous adverse side effects, and they also can lead to violence. I had a lady come to me who was referred for depression because it was affecting her health, and she's a very nice Christian lady. She faithfully attended church with her husband. She had never been on any psychiatric medications. And I was amazed, because I just don't run across that very often. She had been depressed a long time. We discussed her background and created a prayer plan. Here's what she told me. Here's what came up in the prayer plan. I asked her when her depression began. She said, well, when I was a child. I said, well, how early? She said, well, about age 7. I said, what happened at age 7? She said, well, she had a little boy in the classroom that she liked a lot, called him her boyfriend. And one day in class, he laid his head down on the desk, and he died from a brain aneurysm. Right there in class, just died. And she was depressed. I get it. I understand that. Okay, that's where her depression started. When she was 19 years old, she was engaged to a young man that went off to Vietnam, and he got killed. So she lost her fiance. When she was 26, she got married then, and her husband that she married died in a car wreck at age 26. She got married again. At age 40, her second husband died from cancer. At age 48, she had a boyfriend, and he died from cancer. When she's 50 years old, she lost her mother, her father, and her grandparent. And she said, I've been depressed since I was a child. So we began praying about these things. We prayed about every one of those losses and gave it to God. And all that depression cleared up. And when we got done, I prayed about her mother, I remember, and when she gave her grief of the loss of her mother to God, and I prayed, and I said, Lord, what do you want her to know right now? And she had her eyes closed, and she just said, I see her smiling. I just see her smiling with her big brown eyes. I asked her how she felt. She said, I feel happy. No sadness. I'm very calm. She said, it's so simple. I want to help my brother deal with his grief over my mother. When she came back 3 weeks later, she had no depression. She said, I feel everything is lifted off. I don't feel the urge to crawl up in bed or hide and tell people to leave me alone. And she even released some anger she had toward a relative. Those are all the things that we covered on her prayer plan. She gave her sisters copies of the grief booklet and told them to do it, and they did it. They wrote down their losses, and they felt better. And one day she was in Walmart, and she saw a little white-haired lady that looked just like her mom. And she said it reminded her of her mother, and it made her smile. It didn't make her feel sad or depressed. It made her smile. And she said most Tuesdays she was in a really black mood. She says, because that's when Mom died, on a Tuesday. She said, now I feel good on Tuesdays. And I've begun actually doing some visitation with people. And she said, my husband was just blown away. He told the men at church that he had a brand new wife. And she said, everyone should know about this. So we prayed about some sadness too, and we got rid of all this stuff. It's just amazing You can pray with people about their grief. 87% of all depression is caused by grief, see? And when you pray about it, people overcome their depression. I saw another woman who had been depressed for 9 years due to loss of her husband that she'd been married to for 35 years, and she was taking antidepressants, and she was crying all the time, and she really wanted to get off her medications. And so we made a list of 21 things that she missed about him, about her husband, and gave her grief and her sadness to God. And immediately the sadness left, and she felt calm, and she no longer wanted to cry. When I saw her 2 weeks later, she said her depression was just completely gone. That's all she needed, somebody to pray with her about the grief. Now, I hope that this is encouraging to you and exciting to think that you know how to help people with grief. It's not hard. You help yourself with the grief, and you experience it, and you know it works. And then when you have a friend or a neighbor or somebody who's depressed and they've lost somebody, you can do it. It doesn't take a psychologist. It doesn't take a psychology class to do this. You learn how to get rid of grief and pray with people, and you'll be amazed how many people you help overcome all kinds of problems, including depression. I was sharing with a gentleman here a little bit ago another book that I have here that I also think is a pretty awesome book. It's called Anatomy of an Epidemic. This is written by Robert Whitaker. He's a journalist who began investigating psychiatric medications, and because he heard some things that didn't make sense, and he believed, like all the rest of people did, that depression is caused by chemical imbalances and so forth. But he began reading some literature that didn't agree with that, and so he began studying, and he did a very, very thorough review of all the major research on psychiatric medications. And this book is a little more difficult to read than The Medication Madness, but what he concludes is extremely important, because he finds sources of psychiatrists, well-known psychiatrists back in the 70s, that said that in the 70s when a person was diagnosed with depression, that was good, because people just spontaneously got well within about a year's time. They just got well without treatment, with or without treatment. In the 70s, that was it, see? But now we have so many people on antidepressants that they experience chronic depression. They never get well. They just stay on the medications. And they keep taking it, and they keep changing medications. And here's what he found when he looked at the disability records from our country. He found that every day, 250 more children and 850 more adults are added to the disability rolls in our country due to psychiatric problems. And he says we have an epidemic, a mental health epidemic, being caused by psychiatric medications. That's not a popular message, and you write stuff like this. I mean, certain publishers won't even publish it. It's hard to get the word out. But I believe churches are entitled to know. They need to know what the research says. My goal with people when I work with them, if they're depressed, is I want to help them deal with their grief, their anger, their grief, their shame, whatever they have. I want them to have 100% peace when we get done. Now, that doesn't always work out 100%, but most of the time it does. And so that's my goal, is I want to help them get completely rid of the grief and the anger and the shame. So that's a goal I shoot for. In Acts chapter 3, verses 8 through 10, it says this. The early church was excited. And in Acts chapter 3 is when this man was, Peter was going to the temple, and there was a man begging for alms there. And Peter turns to him and says, "Silver and gold have I none, but what I have I give to you. In the name of Jesus, rise up and walk." That man got up and walked. You know what he did? It says with a leap he stood upright. He began to walk, and he entered the temple with him walking and leaping and praising God. You know why? Because he was instantly healed, supernaturally healed, and he got excited about God. And what I believe is that when people see supernatural healing of grief and anger and shame and depression, they get the same way. They get giddy. They want to tell everybody about it. They want to share it. It's powerful. And so I believe it's wonderful to be able to pray with people and watch God's power work. There is so little evidence of power in the typical church that people don't get excited about Jesus. They come and hear a message and hear something, but they don't see it in people's lives. They don't see it makes a difference. About 20% of people in our churches are taking psychiatric medications. That's the way it is in the general population, about 20%. It may be as high as 30%, but the best confirmed report that I've seen is 20%. And so imagine that. See, 20% of people in your church are taking psychiatric medication because they hurt. And the world tells them they need a pill. What they need is, they need prayer. They need Jesus to come in and take all that pain away from them so that they feel joy and they feel peace. God wants to show his power, I believe, in our churches so that men are attracted to it. And he's given us these simple little tools that we can use to help people get set free through prayer. I hope that you will do some more reading and thinking about this. I hope that many of you will buy this book, Medication Madness, and read about it so you learn for yourself all the dangers of these medications and realize that we're being told lies. Because it's in our churches as well. We have come to believe in our churches, just as the world does, that you can find peace in a pill. But you can't. You can't do that. In fact, those pills cause lots of problems. Our church needs to be taught about the hope that is found only in Christ, and that men and women can be set free from depression and addiction and grief and anger, shame through prayer. Colossians chapter 2, verse 8, Paul says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ." I believe this is one of those philosophies, those empty deceptions that we have bought into that we need to be delivered from. It's a major stronghold in our society, in our country, and even in our churches. The belief that our emotions are simply due to chemical imbalance, that we need pills to correct it, is a stronghold that we need to resist and fight. I hope you'll help me spread the news. I hope that you'll use it for yourself. That you'll find the freedom that comes as you get rid of anger and grief and shame. And don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Spread it with people, because that's what we need. That's why Jesus said we're the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. And we ought to be that city on a hill, that we're holding up the light of truth to the world, that we don't have chemical imbalances, we don't have brain disorders. We have problems that the Lord can take from us and give us his total peace and his joy. That ends what I'm going to share with you about depression. Anybody have any questions or comments? All right, did anybody get anything to eat? Nobody? No. Well, I'll tell you what, we needed it. We didn't realize it, but we didn't even have lunch. So that's the reason I was so hungry. I'm trying to remember, are we scheduled to be here, Natalie, till 7 or 7:30? Oh, okay. All right. Do you know 7:30? Okay. All right. Well, I'll tell you what we want to do is, I've got one other section I want to cover with you and talk about trauma. And that's an important issue to deal with. And so we're going to talk about that. And then once we get done with that, what we want to do with the rest of our time is we want to divide into two different groups and have some prayer sessions going on. Some of you went through that the other day, and you got to witness a little bit of that. But that's far more helpful many times than anything else. I mean, you can hear all this, and some people find it overwhelming, but when you see it, it's simple. And it's not a complicated thing in most cases. I mean, sometimes it can get complicated, but usually it's not. So that's the plan, is we'll talk about trauma now, and then we will break into groups and do some prayer demonstration. 2:30 to 7:30. Okay. So if there's anybody here that would like some prayer about something, whatever it may be, and you'd be willing to do that, think that over, okay? And we will make sure everybody here makes a commitment to confidentiality before we do that. But anyway, it's an opportunity for you to observe it, experience it, and to actually see how it works. So one area that I want to talk with you about now, we've talked about depression a little bit. We've talked about substance abuse, helping people overcome addictions. And I want to talk with you about overcoming traumas. There are many different kinds of traumas that people experience, and we will look at this in a little bit. But let me just begin by sharing with you an experience that I had helping people with trauma. In 2010, some of you remember that they had a large earthquake down in Haiti. And I had been to Haiti 5 or 6 times. And I was familiar with some people there that I could minister with, some pastors and so forth. And so after the earthquake happened, of course, it hit the capital city, Port-au-Prince. And they lost a lot of lives there. And so I contacted a pastor in northern Haiti and expressed my interest in coming and teaching the Christians there how to help others that are going through trauma, the trauma being an earthquake. And so he invited me there in 2010 in the summer. We had a pretty good group of people. It was Haiti's a very poor country, and the churches there typically they don't have any air conditioning. It's very hot all the time. But we had a pretty good packed room of people. And I talked with them the first session about grief, how to overcome grief. In the second session, I talked to them about overcoming anger. And we took a break, had a little question and answer time with the folks there. And of course, I speak a little bit of Creole, but not much. I mean, I really rely upon an interpreter to interpret for me. But some people asked questions, and one young lady stood up, and she said that she was in Port-au-Prince when the earthquake hit. And she was in her house, apartment. All the buildings there are built out of concrete blocks. Everything's concrete. The floor is concrete. The ceiling, the roof is concrete. And there's a lot of weight there, see. So when earthquake hits, all that stuff just comes crashing down. And she said that she was in the earthquake and she was trapped for 8 hours. She wasn't seriously injured, but she was trapped. And she had a nephew that was with her, an 8-year-old nephew. And so he was trapped underneath her. And so for 8 hours they trapped, and that was not a good experience. She had some friends that died in the earthquake, and one lady in particular was a pregnant lady that she knew that died in the earthquake, and she said that she had already prayed about the grief of the loss of her neighbor friend, the pregnant lady. Based upon what she had learned that morning from me, talking about grief, she prayed about that and she got rid of it. But she said that she still felt some other emotions. She felt some sadness. She felt sad because this pregnant lady died. She was a very young lady, lost her child. The child died with her. And she was sad because this 8-year-old nephew that was trapped under her was injured pretty badly, and he was still in the hospital. She felt sadness about that. So, and she also felt some fear. She felt some fear that her nephew just might not make it. He might die. So we made a list of the reasons why she was sad. And then we prayed about that. She gave it to God. And after we prayed about that, she said she felt much better. She wasn't shaking anymore, and she wasn't feeling tearful, and she was smiling. Then we prayed about her fear that she had. She was afraid that her nephew could die, and so I prayed and asked the Lord, what do you want her to know about that belief that her nephew might die? And I said, Lord, is there anything you want her to know? And what came to her mind was, he is in my hands, and you don't need to worry about him. That's the thought that popped into her head. And I asked her, so how do you feel now when you think about your nephew? And she said, well, she felt calm. She felt peaceful. No more fear. It was just gone. The fear was gone. The sadness was gone. The grief was gone that she prayed about on her own. And everybody watching that, they could see that. You see a little smile come to her face. And I commented on that. I said, look at the smile on her face right now. Everybody stood up and looked, and they could see the difference. And so that was the first experience I had. That young lady's pastor was there at the church also from Port-au-Prince, and I met him. And he invited me to go to Port-au-Prince with him, and he had a large church there, about 500 people in his church. And so he invited me that Sunday. I went with him, and in his church I spoke in the morning service about how to get rid of grief and how to get rid of anger, and how to do that, if they had experienced some trauma from the earthquake. And so I have a picture here. I wish I could show you all this, but it's a very nice group of people, Christians that love the Lord. In that city of Port-au-Prince, with that church with 500 people, they probably had 5 or 6 people that had jobs. That's how poor they are. And yet they came dressed up. I mean, they love to dress up for church because that's the only time they get to dress up. and they come dressed up nice, and they look like businessmen and women walking in the church. They're very nicely dressed, and they sing with exuberance. I mean, they love to sing, and the services are very enjoyable. So I enjoyed ministering to them and talking, sharing with them how to get rid of grief, how to get rid of anger. And then I commented, I said that if there's anybody here that has some emotions you need prayer about, come sit on the right hand up here, and I will pray with you. So after the meeting, about 24 people gathered over on the side. And I had an interpreter work with me, and one by one, they come up, and I sat down and prayed with them with my interpreter. And the poor guy was really worn out by the end of that afternoon because we were there for hours. But prayed with each one of them. And in some cases, there were people that had grief they had to deal with. Some people had fear. Some of them shared with me that after the earthquake hit, everybody was afraid to go back inside. They were afraid of an aftershock. And so people were living in the streets for a week or two out of fear of an aftershock, see. And so some people had fear that they needed to deal with, and we prayed about that. A lot of grief, and in some cases some anger and some shame. And so we dealt with the post-traumatic stress, the stress disorder that people had that came in various fashions. A definition of post-traumatic stress is when a person has been exposed to a traumatic event that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a death or threat to the physical integrity of self or others, and the person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror. And there are a lot of situations that qualify for that. What happened here, October the 1st last year, qualifies as that. You have a group of people, and they were exposed to a traumatic event where there's actual or threatened death or serious injury. And so a lot of people had different reactions to that. And so a lot of people have PTSD in this town. I mean, were there 20,000 people out there at that concert, approximately? And so that's a lot of people. And many of them are going to probably carry that the rest of their life. But if you learn how to help people with their traumas, you can help them work through that and then get rid of that completely. You can get rid of that. We had the privilege. We had a gentleman that I was introduced there that was sitting on the front row of the concert.
Kevin.
Yeah, a guy named Kevin. And he walked with a cane, and he was sitting on the front row, and when the shooting started, he recognized it. He'd heard machine gun fire before. And his friend that he's with, he pushed him underneath the stage, and they crawled under there. And there was a man underneath the stage in front of them that was already shot. He was bleeding. They had to take off their T-shirts and tie it and try to stop the bleeding, and it probably saved his life. But afterwards, I mean, they had to sit there for 12 minutes watching all the shooting, all the screaming, all the chaos. And he had a clear view right out there watching the field, and seeing women and children getting shot, and policemen trying to get people out of the way, get them to safety, and getting shot. And saw a lot of this stuff happen. That's very traumatic. For 12 minutes, can you imagine for 12 minutes being under that kind of stress? See, and different people will have different reactions to it. But this gentleman, he had a mixture of emotions. He had feelings of anger, which most people probably do. Why would anybody do such a senseless thing? People who have no way to defend themselves, just shooting at them. See, anger about that, and feelings of sadness at all the lasting consequences that people will experience from there. A lot of sadness and grief. People who lost friends and family members. There's grief there, and some have fear. Some of them will have anxiety and fear, the rest of their life if they don't get help for it. And so, I had the privilege. Pastor Russell introduced me to him. I had the privilege Saturday night, 6 days after the shooting, to pray with him, and we prayed about each one of those issues. We prayed about his anger, wrote out the reasons why he's angry, that anybody would do something so terrible, shooting defenseless people, women and children. We made a list of the reasons for his anger. He gave it to God and asked God to take it from him. And his anger left. We prayed about his sadness. He didn't really, I don't think, have any grief. He didn't. I don't remember if he did or not, but he had some sadness. He said because, while he was undercover with the gunfire going on, he thought that he wasn't afraid of dying. That's why he didn't have any fear. He wasn't afraid of dying. He just felt sad for his grandkids that they're going to lose their granddad. We prayed about his sadness, made a list and gave that to God. Made a list of the reasons for his shame. He felt shameful. He felt like, I should have gotten out there and helped people. I mean, he couldn't do much. He had a bad leg anyway, but he felt like he should have tried to help people, save them. We prayed about that. And I asked the Lord, well, Lord, what's the truth you want him to know about that? That he should have tried harder, he could have done more? And the Lord spoke right back to him and said, you did everything you could. You couldn't have done anything more. And that took away that shame, that guilt that he felt. So when we got done, he got rid of all those emotions, see? And there may have been some things we missed, but the next morning when I saw him, he looked a lot better, said he slept a lot better, and felt a whole lot more peaceful. But that's the way you help people with traumas. When they have a trauma, you identify the emotions they have, and one by one you work through them, praying about them until they're all gone, see? And so there's all kinds of PTSD, just call it trauma. But they like to make a distinction. I think it's helpful to distinguish between what's called simple PTSD and complex PTSD. Simple PTSD is a one-time event. Somebody gets sexually abused one time, that's PTSD. It's a one-time event. It's a little easier to help people deal with one event rather than something that's sustained over a year. You know, if you grow up and you're abused every day of your life, see, that's complex PTSD. If you go into the military and you fight in combat for a year or 6 months or whatever, you're shot at every day, you know, you're exposed to dangers, that's extended, it's more complex. See, it's a lot harder to help people overcome complex PTSD than simple PTSD. And so when you have an opportunity to help somebody who's been in the military, you see that because many times there's so much trauma there that they might come for one session or 2 sessions to get a little bit of help, and I've had that happen, and they got help, but they don't want to stir up any more pain. They don't want to talk about it. And they'd rather take a pill, okay? And sadly, you know, the U.S. government's real happy to give you pills. They tried for 30, 40 years, since 1970 basically, when they first defined post-traumatic stress disorder. They tried for at least 30 years to help people through group therapy and counseling and found it really didn't work. They quit funding it. And now all they do is give people medications that don't help them. It doesn't help them, but it just further disables them. So anyway, there's simple PTSD and then there's complex PTSD. So what I do is, when I talk with them, I identify the emotions that they feel, and then we select the strongest emotion that they are experiencing and try to help them resolve that. So if the person has a lot of grief, you know, we'll start with that. We'll deal with the grief and try to get rid of all the grief related to the incident. If it's anger, we'll deal with the anger. Deal with one emotion at a time, and once you get that resolved, they're 100% at peace there, then move on to the next emotion, okay? And then you deal with the anger, and then you deal with any feelings of shame, see if there's anything left. When I get done with them, I like to say, so now think about that traumatic thing that happened to you. In your mind, think it over and tell me how you feel. When they say they feel 100% peace, then we're done. The PTSD is gone, see? And so that's how I work with people with trauma, and I've seen people with all kinds of trauma get healing when I work with them in this fashion. Just recognize that PTSD is a mixture of emotions that people have as a result of a traumatic event. You identify those emotions, and then you, one by one, you work on them. So there are many kinds of traumas. Sexual abuse trauma, we've kind of touched on that previously. Let me just briefly say that most of the time when people experience some kind of sexual abuse, you know, if it's a single incident, for example, they will feel feelings of anger at the person. They will feel feelings of shame most of the time. Even if they're 4 years old and you know, an adult molested them, they still feel shameful, like it's my fault, I should have done something, I should have told somebody, or I should have cried for help, or I should have resisted more. See, they think those kind of things. And of course that's not true. You're 4 years old, you're defenseless, you're small, you know, there's really not anything you do, but the devil loves to do that to people who are victimized. He loves to put that thought in their head that, you know, you should have tried harder. You're dirty, you're shameful, you're bad because you didn't do it, see, or maybe you got some enjoyment or pleasure out of it. That doesn't mean you're bad. But anyway, those are the kind of things that children often experience. Physical abuse that people go through, they've been through a lot of trauma and leads usually to anger, relationship problems, And sometimes feelings of shame too, because they feel like when the person abuses them, the person tells them they're stupid, they should not have done that, and they hit them, they physically abuse them because they blame them for something. So sometimes they feel shameful. And you have to help them with feelings of shame as well. There's a lady that came to me for counseling, and she's a Christian lady. She came for help because she's really unhappy. She couldn't sleep well. She was having nightmares. She had flashbacks from abuse that she'd been through, and she'd had a car wreck. Almost died in a car wreck. And all these things happened, and so she had multiple sources of trauma. It wasn't just a single incident. She had lots of different causes of her trauma. And she was taking medication to help her sleep, but it wasn't working very well, wasn't sleeping well. She was living with her Christian husband, who was very good to her. And when they first got married, she was unstable, and a man came along she got involved with and ran off with this boyfriend. And for 13 years, he abused her. And finally one day, he got thrown in jail for something, and she was able to escape and get away from him and came back home. And amazingly, her husband was tickled to have her back and very forgiving and received her back. She assured me that he was good to her. He wasn't resentful. He loved her and he was good to her, but she still wrecked with all kinds of unhappiness and shame and guilt and difficulty. So we began to pray about these traumas. She had been abused as a child by her father. She'd been molested as a child. She was brutally abused by her boyfriend for 13 years, and then she had this car wreck that almost killed her, and she had all those traumas to deal with. So I made a prayer plan for her. And she had 4 sources of anger, 2 sources of grief, 1 source of fear was a car wreck, and then the feelings of shame from the sexual abuse she went through. And we just systematically prayed about one at a time. Just prayed about one, get complete healing there, we pray about another one. Next session, we pick it up from there and keep praying. We prayed through the prayer plan and got rid of all those things. And she was able to get rid of all that. And she got rid of her depression. She began sleeping well. Got to meet her husband. He's a very nice, kind gentleman, loving Christian man. And we had to pray about some fears also. Many times with PTSD, there are fears that people have. Specifically for her, it was the car wreck. She told me that she was driving down a 4-lane highway in a mountainous area and taking curves and so forth. And she's trying to pass a large truck on the left-hand side. And as she came around this corner, there's a car stalled on the highway in front of her. And she tried to squeeze between the car and the truck, but it didn't work. And the back wheels of the truck flipped her car over upside down into the median. And in the process of doing that, it scalped her. I mean, just ripped all the hair, skin off of the top of her head, and she was laying upside down bleeding. She thought she was going to die. Well, it turns out it wasn't that serious. She didn't have any serious injuries, and by the time she got out of the hospital, her husband had bought her a new car, and he was very supportive and loving, but she had fears. She couldn't get in the car anymore. She could get in the car and drive, but she was afraid to pass a truck or pass another car. So we prayed about that. I said, I want you to think about passing that truck, and I'm going to pray for you, and you remember what it felt like. And I said, Lord, what do you want her to know about that belief that something terrible is going to happen? She's going to die if she tries to pass a vehicle. And I said, be quiet and just see if the Lord tells you anything. And she said that what happened was, she said she suddenly realized that God had protected her and taken care of her. That nobody got hurt, except her. Out of all that, nobody was killed. And nothing serious. There were no long-term damages or anything, but the Lord brought it to her mind that He was with her, He was protecting her, He was taking care of her. And I asked about that belief that it was going to happen again. And the thought the Lord brought to her was, I was with you then, and I'm still with you. I'm taking care of you. And when she got that thought in her head, the Lord set her free. The fear was just suddenly gone. She's able to get back on the highway and drive without any extraordinary problems. And so that's a way you should deal with fears. See, fears are an example of what I called belief-based emotions. They're like shame. is based on what you believe. The fear, the underlying beliefs behind fear are things like something terrible is going to happen, or they're going to come back and get me, I'm going to die. Thoughts like that go through the person's head, and they're very fearful. And you can't talk them out of those fears because they're kind of embedded in there, see, along with that memory. But I'll tell you what works is when you pray and say, Lord, what is the truth that you want this person to know about the belief that they're going to die, something terrible is going to happen to them. And once you pray that and they listen, the Lord brings truth to their heart and their mind that just completely sets them free from that. It's a pretty awesome thing to watch that happen. But this woman was set free from her fears, as well as from all the trauma she went through, the multiple traumas she'd been through. I run into a lot of people that have fears of storms. I've had many clients I'll be sitting with in the office, and then, dark clouds start rolling in, there's a little thunder going on outside, and the person starts getting nervous because they've had some bad experiences in storms, and they get very anxious. And probably some people right here probably have some of that. But it happens a lot of times. There's a woman I saw who said she'd always been fearful in storms, and I asked her when was the first time that happened, when did that get started? And she said, well, this woman came from a very abusive home. Her father was extremely abusive to her, and we did a lot of praying about that, and she got rid of a lot of that. But her brothers were mean to her, having grown up in an abusive family. They were mean to her too. And she said that when she was a little girl that one time her brothers tied her up outside to an oak tree during a storm, a lightning storm. And she was scared to death. She screamed and she cried and she struggled. And it took a long time, but she finally was able to get away from the ropes and got set free. And she ran, hid under the house until the storm was over. So she's been afraid of storms ever since. So I said, okay, I want you to remember what it felt like when you were tied to that tree and what was going through your head. And she said, I just knew I was going to die. I knew I was going to get struck with lightning. And I prayed and I said, Lord, what is the truth? Is that true that she was going to get struck by lightning and she was going to die? And the truth that came to her was this. God said that she wasn't alone. She said she didn't know it, but he was with her. He was with her and protected her. And he actually saved her. He had actually enabled her to get out of the ropes and get loose. And she said, he saved me for a reason. She said, somebody helped loosen those ropes for me so I could get out. Now this is not stuff she made up. This is just thoughts that came to her from the Lord as she prayed. And after that, I asked her how she felt when she thought about storms. And she said, she felt good. She felt relief. She felt calm. And she said, it's pretty awesome. And so I've seen a lot of people like that had fears like that of storms that got set free. 3 steps for overcoming fear. It's the same thing as 3 steps for dealing with shame. First step is identify the source of the fear, where it started. Identify the source. Number 2, identify the underlying beliefs that you felt at that time, that you believed. Like, I'm going to die, something terrible is going to happen, they're going to come back and get me, or it's going to happen again. See, those are the usual kind of beliefs that people have. Identify the underlying beliefs. That's step number 2. And step number 3, pray for truth and listen. As you do that, God will, through His Holy Spirit, and the Comforter will come in and bring the truth that you need to be set free. Tell you what, that's a whole lot better than what the world has to offer, because they don't have much to offer. All they want to do is give you psychiatric medications, anti-anxiety medications, and I told you that the VA withdrew their support for PTSD programs in about 2000 due to their ineffectiveness. And now they're spending about $3.3 billion a year on psychiatric medications without any proof that those medications are even helping people with their PTSD. In fact, the Congress was interested in learning if there really is anything that works to help people with PTSD, because they're having to deal with this all the time, and with military folks that come back and they deal with PTSD and they commit suicide and all kinds of things. So they commissioned an independent scientific group called the National Academy of Sciences to study this issue and give them a report on whether PTSD treatments actually work. And what they concluded is this. As far as medications, psychiatric medications, they concluded this. They found the evidence for medications inadequate to conclude that they work. They didn't find that there's any good evidence from good studies that any of the psychiatric medications help people with PTSD. Other therapies, inadequate evidence to conclude that they actually helped either. There's one kind of therapy they said helped a little bit, called exposure therapy, where you just expose a person to that same memory, that same trauma over and over and over again, and they say there's a little evidence that it works. They don't say how much, just that it's better than nothing. So it doesn't mean it's effective, but that's the only thing they found any research evidence that actually helped any for PTSD. Now, most people don't even know the research. Most therapists, most counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists don't even know the evidence. They don't even know the research. They just keep doing the same thing over and over because that's all they know to do. And I went to a workshop that was done one time in Oklahoma, in Tulsa. And this lady who was a presenter was a psychologist, and she's a very nice lady. My guess is she probably was a Christian. But she was advertised as a trauma expert, and so the whole workshop was about trauma. She's talking about how to help people with trauma. And she started talking about medications, and she was wandering kind of up and down the aisles and talking with a microphone on her. And I was sitting toward the back, and she walked right up next to me and turned around and started to turn around and walk back. When she said these words, she said, SSRIs, that's a kind of antidepressant. SSRIs are very effective in treating PTSD, she said, and they can heal PTSD. She said that, and I knew the research, and I knew that was just blatantly untrue. And it shocked me so much, and I've never done this before or since, but she turned around and started walking toward the front, and I loudly said, excuse me, and she turned around and said, yes, and I said, you just made the statement that SSRIs can heal people with PTSD. I said, I've seen a lot of people with PTSD and taken medications, and I've never seen it heal somebody with PTSD. And I realized that might be a little harsh for her in a presentation, so I tried to soften it. I said, are you trying to say that they help people, or are you saying they actually heal people? And she said, no, that's probably a better way of saying it, that they can help people with PTSD. But I knew the literature, I knew the research. That just was untrue. The National Academy of Sciences found no evidence that it actually helped. And so, nonetheless, what they prescribe most of the time for vets that are struggling with PTSD is they just put on medications. That's all they do. Anti-anxiety medications, sometimes they put them on antidepressants also. The problems with these anti-anxiety medications is they're extremely addictive. That's one problem. Some of you may have been on them before. You know what I'm talking about. You know, maybe it's Valium or Xanax. It's probably one of the worst ones. Very, very strong anti-anxiety medication. And when you first take it, it feels like a miracle. You know, you're all stirred up and you're anxious. You take it and it just suddenly disappears. I mean, you feel so calm and peaceful. You think, wow, that's powerful. That's good. Okay? The problem is, after about a week or two, you can be addicted to it and you can't get off it. And the withdrawal from Xanax or Valium is worse than withdrawal from heroin. You can get addicted to it real fast. And not only does that happen, but after a short while it begins to wear off. Where it may be helping you, this pill may be helping you for a while, but then a few weeks later, it's losing its effect, and so you need a little more, and you want to take a little earlier. The effect wears off quicker, and then you want more. And then you start abusing it because you feel like you need it. You know, it wears off and you start feeling anxious. And what they found is the studies actually show that for 8 to 10 weeks, after 8 to 10 weeks of exposure to these anti-anxiety medications, the people that were taking them were actually more phobic and fearful and anxious than they were before they started. There was a 350% increase in the panic attacks for which they're being treated. Helps momentarily, helps instantly, and then it begins to wear off, and then you can't get off it. I've seen a lot of Christian people that got on anti-anxiety medications because of some injury, some physical pain they had, and then they couldn't get off it, and they were addicted to it. Very, very hard to get off. Not only that, but there are all kinds of adverse side effects that come with it, including sleep disturbances, hallucinations, agitation, rage, irritability, and aggressive and hostile behavior that are reported along with these anti-anxiety medications. And that's what Stephen Paddock was on. He was on Valium. And more than likely, he was experiencing some of that agitation, the rage, and delusions even that can come that lead people who are on these medications. And so they're very dangerous. See, the world's solution is not a good one. Very, very serious. Now let me mention several other kinds of traumas. There are natural disaster traumas, such as earthquakes, tornadoes, tsunamis. People that go through these experiences, these natural disasters, many times are traumatized. They're afraid they're going to die. And they've lost, in many cases, they've lost their homes, they've lost family members and so forth. You see, every time there's a natural disaster like that, there's people that rush to their aid and help, and that's good. We need people also to know how to help go there and help people find freedom from the emotional trauma, see. And that's my hope, is that as more people get trained, people learn how to do it, they'll be confident with it. You know, if we have another tragedy in California, you guys are closer to it than me, see. Some of you will get confident enough to where you can go and help out and link up with other people. Tornadoes. We were hit by a tornado 3 years ago. My house was, and my son had come to visit us, and he and his wife had just been there like 2 hours, and the weather was bad outside, and I was sitting there watching the news, and they're talking about tornadoes all around, but there wasn't anything on the news that indicated that there's anything close to us. My son went upstairs on the second floor and looked out the window with his wife, and he saw a funnel heading straight for us. He came running downstairs and said, "It's coming right toward us. We got to go." We ran out the back door into our storm shelter. We just got the storm shelter about 6 months before that. And we went into the storm shelter, and 5 minutes later we came out and our roof was gone. I put the roof on 9 days earlier and it lost the whole roof. You know, it was kind of, I wasn't traumatized. We had a lot of work to do. But later my son admitted he was traumatized. He had some trauma, and it stirred up some stuff. And we had to pray about it. Had to pray about the fear that he had, and it was an irrational fear from some childhood things. And anyway, he was able to get rid of it. So natural disasters can cause PTSD. And the most common emotions are grief, sadness, anger, shame, and fear. There are also man-made traumas, and I'll talk about those in a minute. Let me give you another example of a woman that was afraid of storms. This lady came to me, and she said that she had this intense fear of storms. And she said, I need to get rid of this because my kids are seeing it, and I'm afraid they're going to become fearful and phobic just like me. So I asked her, I said, when's the first time that you felt this, when you experienced this? And she said she was 5 years old. She and her mother had gone to visit a friend out of town, and so she was with her little girlfriend, and her mom and the other girl's mom had gone off to go shopping. And dark clouds came rolling in, and the sirens went off to indicate there was a tornado. Television and radio stations saying there's a tornado headed your direction. So it was heading right toward them. The two little girls and whoever else was with them went in the bathroom. They crawled in the bathtub and they laid down. But the little girl that was with her was just screaming her head off. So she was terrified. And they were scared to death they're going to die. Well, they survived it. But ever since then, she was fearful. Anytime there's clouds, anytime there's a storm coming through, she'd get very fearful. And so I asked her, "Should I like to get rid of it?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Well, I want you to close your eyes and picture that day when that storm came through there, and remember how you felt and what you were thinking." So she did that, and she said, "I believe we're all going to die." So I prayed, "Lord, what is the truth you want her to know right now about that belief that she was going to die?" And what the Lord said into her mind was this: nothing happened because He kept us safe. And she thought of this scripture that says, "Which of you by worrying can add a single hour to his life?" A scripture popped into her mind. And I said, "Lord, is there anything else you want her to know?" And she said, "God keeps us safe. And besides which, we always have some warning when a tornado comes." And she said, "I have to straighten up for the sake of my kids." I asked her how she felt now. I said, "Visualize that storm coming again and imagine it. Tell me how you feel." She said, "Well, it seems kind of silly now and weird." She said, "We were safe and I'm okay." And her phobia of storms was gone. So you see how fears work? They're a belief-based emotion. It's based upon a lie that you believe at the time. And when you recognize that, you pray and say, "Lord, what is the truth you want me to know?" He'll set you free from that. I've seen many people with storm fears that got set free. There are also many man-made traumas. Sexual abuse of all forms is man-made. Murders, criminal assaults, abortions, military trauma, physical abuse, wars, Those are all man-made things, see? Lots of kinds of traumas that you can experience. I also dealt with a lady. I mean, a lot of people go through car wrecks. They have car wrecks and they get traumatized. I worked with a lady who witnessed a helicopter crash. She worked at a hospital, and this helicopter was coming in to pick up a patient, and its blades hit a light pole or something, and it crashed, and everything went flying everywhere. This lady was close to it. She saw it, and debris from the helicopter came flying through her windshield, and she thought she was going to die. So she hid down under the dashboard until it was all over, and then she felt a lot of guilt because she felt like, I'm a medical person. I should be out there helping people. I shouldn't be hiding. I shouldn't be fearful. So she had guilt and shame. She had anger, at the helicopter pilot and the people that were giving them directions that they would make a mistake like that. She felt sadness and grief over the people that died in the helicopter. We had to pray through every one of those. And so that's an example of a trauma too. Sometimes there are industrial accidents that people go through, that they experience, and that they have trauma from that, or explosions or fires. And I prayed with people who've been through fires and lost people in fires and so forth. But always the Lord is able to take it all and clear it up and take all that fear from the person so that they have peace. I had the chance to go down to Dallas back in 2013. And I shared these prayer principles with some folks there that are missionaries or planning to be missionaries and learning other languages. And I shared this, and I said, if anybody wants some prayer, I would be glad. We're going to meet together as a small group for anybody who wants to pray. We had an office one of the teachers allowed us to use. And so after the meeting, about 6 people came, and we gathered around this table. And this one lady who had been a missionary told me that she had some trauma. She said she was working as a missionary in Africa, and she was helped translating the Bible into the native language there. And she developed a close relationship with a lady there that she loved, and she was ministering to and getting to know. And this lady was helping her learn the language and helping her learn the words for in her language. And so anyway, she worked with her quite a bit. And one day while they were in the village, some terrorists came into town with weapons. They started firing. And they heard the report of this, and so their director told them to get out of there as fast as they could. And I don't remember if they flew out or if they had a car, but they took off. They took off, and she wasn't able to go back. She didn't know what happened to her friends. And she had a lot of nightmares and fears. She was afraid. I mean, she felt shame and guilt that she'd gone away. She hadn't ever shared the gospel with her friend that was helping her. And so we prayed about these things. She had a lot of sadness about all her friends and colleagues that were left behind. And that lady that was helping her translate, she identified 23 things that she missed about her. And she gave that to God and got rid of that grief, suddenly losing that close friendship that she developed. And she felt guilt because she had not shared the gospel with her and just wondered about her salvation. And when I prayed for truth, what the Lord said to her was that her time there was not a failure, it wasn't a loss, and she knew that she was loved. And she could visualize in her mind this lady just smiling at her. And she said it made her feel happy. We prayed about each one of those things that she struggled with. And she said also that she had fear. She was worried about her friends and that something terrible was going to happen. And I asked her, when's the first time she felt that fear? And she said, probably when I was a child, about 5 years old. She said her father was terrified of tornadoes. And every time a tornado siren would go off, even though a tornado never hit them, he was just in a panic, and he'd rush everybody down the stairs, to get down there. And she kind of acquired this fear of tornadoes from him. And so we prayed about it. Prayed and asked the Lord what he wanted her to know about that belief that they're going to die. The tornado was going to kill them. And she's able to get the truth that the Lord was protecting her. The Lord was taking care of her. He is the one that had saved her and protected her that whole time. She sent me an email 5 days later after I'd been down there. And here's what she wrote. She said, we had a pretty good thunderstorm the other night, and I was completely unfazed. And I was able to sleep through the night without being conscious of the noise outside. She said, wow, Haven't ever had that happen. Praise the Lord. Pretty awesome. Let's say she was able to get rid of her trauma in Africa. She was able to get rid of trauma about the storms, and that took away of other fears that she had, and so forth. But that's the way the Lord works to help us, relieve us of fears that we have.